Child by L.A. Lewis. An English traveller, delayed in an unfamiliar village, hears a troubling local legend, one the villagers are reluctant to discuss. Drawn by curiosity into a nearby wood no one dares enter, he finds the past is not so easily buried. What he encounters there resists explanation, hovering uneasily between tragedy and nightmare. The tale unfolds slowly in quiet conversation and half-glimpsed memory before leading the listener into something far darker and far stranger than expected. Not everything seen can be forgotten, even when forgetting is all we want.
Everybody dies, don't they? It's funny how isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back? What's the secret?
The Child by L.A. Lewis. Because I'm not a member of the Psychical Research Society, and because I have never attempted to write a work of reference on occult subjects, I do not arrogate to myself any claim as an authority on such matters. Therefore, I shall not put forward a so-called scientific explanation of my experience at Wailing Dip, preferring to leave this task to anyone clever enough to recognize the place from my account. Its real name, of course, is different. Naturally, I've read a mint of other people's efforts, both serious textbooks and works of fiction, but in spite of all the mass of conjectures about spirit manifestation which they have contained, I'm left guessing as to whether what I encountered in that revolting house was a spirit craving incarnation and angered by cruelly thwarted desire, or some monstrous survival, if anything more horrifying still. I got let in for the business entirely through my own curiosity, having always been keen on tales of the supernatural. I happened to be making a trip on my motorcycle to spend a couple of weeks with an old school friend on the other side of England, and having plenty of time to spare, was amusing myself, sidetracking from the main road wherever the countryside was most attractive, in the hope of discovering some of those really old-world villages that one may still occasionally unearth in these days of the charabanc and filling station. Wailing Dip, its real name is equally quaint, proved to be one of those, and so charmingly unspoilt that I suppose I should have eventually paid it a lengthy visit even if my machine had not elected to break down just as I arrived. As it was, I found that it would be quite 2 days before the nearest garage could get spares from London and have me ready for the road again, and as I was still far from my destination, I decided to stop to supervise the job. I accordingly wired my friend and I was hung up and went to arrange accommodation at the village inn. The latter was in every way in keeping with the place itself, a dear little half-timbered cottage with delightful rose gardens at the back, extending to the borders of a dense wood. The landlady, an old-fashioned motherly sort, who told me she'd been running the place with the help of her 2 daughters since her husband's death 6 years before, made no difficulty about giving me a bed. And it was not long before I had collected my bag from the carrier of the motorcycle, washed my hands and face over the sink in the back kitchen, and taken a pint of beer out to a little table in the garden, where I relaxed myself to that particularly keen enjoyment which only a summer evening in the heart of the country can give. Mrs. Jackson, as I will call the landlady, came out about half an hour later to see if I wanted any more ale, and her daughters, apparently being able to cope with whatever business was in the tap room, stayed talking for some little while. After I had told her a few things about myself, or where I was bound for, and how I came to be passing through the village, I remarked on my appreciation of a place so wonderfully restful and off the beaten track, and began to question her about the locality. Seeing that the spares I'm held up for can hardly get here before tomorrow evening, I said, I should like to spend the day exploring the neighbourhood. Perhaps you can advise me if there are any places of special interest that I ought to see. She mentioned 1 or 2 old churches within a 5-mile radius, in addition to Gormingley Park, the seat of the local county family. She feared, however, that I would not be able to look over the last-named place, since the family were in residence. They were, she explained, the chief landowners of the district. Whaling Dip itself being all part of the property. The squire's one of the best, she added, old-fashioned like the village. He's never yet turned out a tenant who couldn't pay his rent so long as it was really a case of hard luck or illness. And as for trespassing, why, the village folk can come and go as they like on his estate, outside the gardens, of course. And he never summons them, not unless they're poaching. Well, I replied, if that's the case, I think I'll spend an hour or two at least rambling in that wood. It looks beautiful, no distance to walk. As Mrs. Jackson made no reply, I turned to look at her, and found, to my surprise, that she was staring at me with an expression of the utmost concern. "Don't go in that wood, sir," she said, almost in a whisper. "There are plenty of others as pretty." "But, good Lord," I exclaimed, "what's the matter with the place?" For I could read positive fear in her eyes. Then I added, for the sake of saying something, "It's an old-fashioned district, but surely you don't date back to the dragons." "There you go, sir," she retorted most angrily, "laughing at everything before you even know what it is, just like the present generation." Then, realizing that I might be offended, for after all she'd only known me an hour, she went on with a rather forced smile. "You young gentlemen from the big cities today don't believe in anything you can't see and touch, so I'm not going to say any more. But speaking for myself, I wouldn't go in that wood alone for £1,000, and if you want to laugh, sir, you may, but I still won't go." I was intrigued. This smelt like something really worth investigating. "Mrs. Jackson," I said, "because I arrive in this village on a motorcycle, a form of transport that I detest, but can afford, don't class me with the type that carries a leggy flapper on the pillion and sports a cigarette holder a yard long. Believe me, I have really quite a serious mind. I've never seen a ghost, but would like to. I certainly don't laugh at them. You obviously have a good story to tell. Now, be an equally good soul, get me another tankard, bring yourself just what you feel like, and spare a bit more time to tell it." I had to say a lot more to convince her of my earnestness, but eventually elicited an unpleasant piece of local history, which would have been interesting enough, even without the sequel. It appeared that situated near the middle of the wood, which was 100 acres in extent and very dense, there was a gamekeeper's cottage, which had been inhabited by the same family in the squire's employ for an indefinite period, the job of safeguarding that particular covert having passed from father to son for several generations. The last gamekeeper, however, had never had any children, and on his death, only 7 years ago, a North countryman and his wife had been taken on to fill the vacancy. The man, according to Mrs. Jackson, had been quite a decent sort, if just a bit morose and unwilling to mix with the village people, but his wife, though good-looking, had aroused an antagonism soon amounting to hatred from the first moment she appeared. She was extremely selfish and greedy for money, and seemed to derive no pleasure from looking after the cottage for her husband, with whom, it was said, she continually had the most frightful scenes. Unlike him, she was not averse to the society of her fellow creatures, nor was she above coming into the inn unescorted and drinking gin copiously with any poacher or passing tramp who would join her. At these times, when her tongue was loosened, she made no secret of her opinions as to the dead and alive character of the village, the shamefully humble nature of her husband's work, and the even more shameful smallness of his wages. Some of the older women in the village had tried to reason with her, pointing out that many others were satisfied with similar occupations on the squire's land, and found their men's pay ample to bring up a happy family into the bargain. To which she flashed out that she wanted no squalling brat to guzzle the money that was already insufficient for two. Presently, however, the word went round, as such things will in a small community, that she was undoubtedly going to have a baby, and many were the hopes expressed that its advent would soften her and bring out the good which must be somewhere in her nature. In due time, the child was stillborn and buried a few days later near the village churchyard, the father alone attending the funeral. When the wife was able to be about again, it was at once seen that no good had come of her experience. Rather, she was more slovenly and discontented than ever, and began to pay more frequent visits to the tap room. Some pitied her, putting down her behaviour to the sense of fruitless travail. Others swore, by her own former statement, that she was glad to have no extra mouth to feed. A few hinted that the child had not been stillborn. The following year, she brought another one into the world with the help of an old midwife who had attended all the births in the village for half a century, but who had not been called in the first time. It lived a fortnight and was found by its father suffocated in its cradle the day after the old cottager had gone back to her home. The wife said that she had been out in the wood for an hour chopping sticks, and that the baby must have turned over in its sleep. The third year there came another, and this too met with an untimely end, being found with its neck broken on the floor beneath the cradle, which stood on a comparatively high trestle table, to be, as the mother explained, less easy for the cat to reach. By this time everybody was talking, which, considering the woman's reputation, was not surprising. And when, the following year, a fourth tragedy took place, the 2-month child this time having no marks to indicate the cause of death, an inquest was held by the express order of the squire. The post-mortem revealed that some sharp, thin instrument, such as a hat-pin, had been passed through one of the eardrums into the brain, and the traces of any external bleeding must have been carefully washed away after the flow had ceased. A verdict of willful murder was recorded against the mother, and the case passed to the next assizes, where she was found guilty but insane and sent to an asylum. Her husband then threw up his job and left the neighbourhood, and the village concluded that the terrible drama it had witnessed was at an end. There was, however, one more act to come. Several months later, the woman made her escape, and though the asylum authorities tried to keep it dark while attempting her recapture, the fact leaked out owing to her being seen by a courting couple entering the wood at Wailing Dip. Suspecting what had happened, these young people notified the village constable, who, through his county station, confirmed the escape. He also learned that the convicted murderess, who, it must be remembered, had not committed her crime until her last-born was 2 months old, was once more an expectant mother. A search party was formed, and had already spent some hours beating the side of the wood adjacent to the village, when word came through that the fugitive had been seen emerging on the far side and making her way towards a desolate stretch of moorland known as the Great Waste. Further scouring of the wood was thereupon called off, and those of the search party who were willing to continue their services were taken round to the new starting point in police cars. To cut a long story short, the mad woman was never captured. She had had nearly 2 hours' start from the time she left the wood, owing to the fact that her second witness, not knowing of the hue and cry, had failed to report seeing her leave it. With the assistance of bloodhounds, she was traced to the edge of the abysmally deep potholes which dot the moor in that region. Failure to pick up the scent from that point was proof enough that she had either jumped or fallen into the abyss. And there the matter had to rest after a few half-hearted attempts to descend with ropes and lanterns. But ever since then, Mrs. Jackson concluded, the feeling has grown around here that the wood and the cottage are haunted, and I doubt if a solitary soul has stepped inside its boundaries these 2 years, excepting one poacher from a hamlet 20 miles away who went there after pheasants and came in to me for the stiffest drink I'd got, that scared he couldn't or wouldn't tell exactly what he'd seen. But, I said, doesn't he sometimes shoot over it? Mrs. Jackson shook her head. Since that night, sir, there's never been a game bird in the whole covert. Never a fox, never even a badger as far as I know. You could stop with me at 12-month, and you'd never hear the cry of one, night or day. Plenty in the other woods, but not this side of the house. Besides, she dropped her tone to a whisper, it's not only what doesn't live in the woods, sir, it's the poultry and things that's killed and taken away from the village, sir, by something that comes out of the wood. So people say. But good God, ejaculated, what do they think it is that haunts the wood? Your story's horrible enough in all conscience without the final touch about stolen chickens, which are most likely taken by foxes. But has anyone ever seen a ghost there? If so, what's it like? Is it the mad woman herself, or the poor little wretches she destroyed? Surely they would excite more pity than fear. Mrs. Jackson looked at me fixedly for a long, long moment before she answered, and twice I thought she was about to speak, and twice she failed. Then at last, I have seen nothing, sir, and I don't think there's another woman or man in the village who has, because we've never stepped through the fence since that night she died. It's just the way we feel, and, as I've told you, sir, I, for my part, will not for £10,000. But the poacher, I cried out, the man from 20 miles away who was after pheasants. Once more she looked at me fixedly in the same compelling silence. He died, sir, within the month, of drink and delirium, shouting out the words he first uttered when he staggered into my kitchen long after I'd closed the bar. The child! Oh God! The horrible child! As may be imagined, this revolting story did more than fire my imagination for a ghost hunt. So graphically had Mrs. Jackson told it, and so obviously certain was she in her own mind that some dreadful curse or haunting had been left in the wood, that I found myself visualizing the murder or murders with uncomfortable clarity. And although I enjoyed the excellently cooked supper which I later consumed in a cosy lamplit parlour, I quite failed to derive the anticipated comfort from my night's rest in a little lean-to room which I had first much admired, notwithstanding the old-fashioned luxury of a feather bed. My window, for one thing, looked out upon the wood, and I must confess that my brain persisted in speculating on what I should encounter there the next day. For I had determined to reconnoitre it when full daylight should give me confidence. Towards morning I slept a little, my rest broken by half-waking dreams of weird formless things watching my window from the gloom of the thicket. I rose early and breakfasted well, telling Mrs. Jackson that 1 o'clock would suit me admirably for lunch. Then, carefully leaving my cap behind, for I knew that she would otherwise ask my destination and try to dissuade me, I strolled out, ostensibly to admire the garden. Once there, I quickly got out of sight among the pergolas and was soon through the wire fencing. My first action, after progressing some yards among the trees, was to produce my penknife and cut a stout branch from an ash sapling, which I trimmed off to a length of 3 feet. This imparted a measure of comfort and would be useful for poking into hollow trunks or killing possible adders. For one half of me never expected results in the ghost hunt, and sought to treat the expedition as a nature study ramble. The thickness of the undergrowth amazed me, since the upper foliage was extremely luxuriant, and I had noticed in other woods that such a condition usually killed off ground vegetation through lack of sun. Here, apparently, the soil, or some kind of dark loam, was sufficiently fertile to counteract this tendency, so that, what with trailing brambles and wild briars and thick curtains of creepers falling from higher branches, progress was really hard. I remember thinking, too, that it was for the same reason quite the gloomiest wood I had seen, a place of perpetual twilight even in this glorious June weather. I had made up my mind to seek out the cottage first, and then, if it revealed nothing of interest, to spend the rest of the morning idling about after insects and wildflowers. So, remembering that it was near the centre of the wood, I endeavoured to keep a course at right angles to the border from the point of entry, no easy matter in so tangled a thicket. At last, however, I burst through a screen of dead brushwood into a kind of leafy tunnel, much overgrown but clearly a path. Just to my right, another track branched off on the opposite side, roughly in the direction I had been following, and after a moment's thought, I took to it, beating the brambles aside with my stick as I went along. All this time, but for the occasional clatter of a wood pigeon taking flight 40 feet overhead, I realized that I had been progressing in most uncanny silence. There had been no bird song, no scuttling of rabbits or rats, and never a sign of a squirrel. The fact dawned on me queerly, and I began to look round more carefully for traces of wildlife. There were, I observed, plenty of old nests in the bushes, and I had already stumbled into more than one rabbit hole, but whether any rabbits slept in the warrens underground, or whether they had been killed or driven out by fear of the unknown thing at which Mrs. Jackson had hinted, I couldn't guess. Despite the warmth, I shivered and tramped on along the winding path. Then, round a sharp bend, I was suddenly confronted by the cottage, a grey stone building, slate roof, and almost buried in a mass of ivy. Unlike those of most deserted dwellings, its windows were intact, though of course uncurtained, and the fact that the front door stood wide open, mute testimony to that last gamekeeper's state of mind when he took away his sticks of furniture, almost lent the place an air of immediate habitation. The cottage was much larger than I'd expected, having 2 stories, and I stood gazing at it for quite a minute before approaching further. Then, acting on some impulse of caution that I've never quite defined, I removed my shoes and stole in absolute silence across the small clearing until I stood on the front step, peering into the cobwebby little hall. The benefit I might have expected from the break in the trees forming the dwelling site was negatived by the obvious fact the fine spell was at an end. For during my short journey the sky had become obscured by thunderclouds, so that the interior of the house was no lighter than the thicket through which I had come. But for this, I might have seen the baby handprints in the dust before I heard the cry. As it was, the sound reached me first, and I stiffened against the lintel in sheer astonishment. "Tata? Tata?" came clearly in a childish treble from somewhere upstairs, accompanied by the rhythmic thumping of some hard object on the bare boards. I stood absolutely petrified. It was so unmistakably the babble of a very young child that has not yet learned to speak, and yet Mrs. Jackson had said definitely that no one lived in the place, or indeed would venture near it. Still, someone must obviously be residing here unknown to the village, and I was about to announce myself with a "Hello there!" when I realized that if so, they must be purposely in hiding, perhaps from the law, and closed my lips. It was then that I glanced down and saw the little hand marks in the dust underneath the tiles. They made definite tracks in all directions, crossing and recrossing each other, many of them partially smudged out where the baby's knees had followed as it had evidently crawled on all fours. Some traversed the step on which I was standing, indicating that it had been outside the cottage as well, and quite recently too, for there was not a speck of dust on these more clearly visible impressions. It struck me then, with a shudder for which I could not quite account, since the matter was more odd than terrifying, that every single imprint I could see had been made by the child itself. Nowhere was there the least sign of an adult footprint, and yet such thick dust must have lain many days, I could have believed months, since the last sweeping. I frowned thoughtfully and began tiptoeing across the flags to the foot of the stairs. After all, I was not going back at this point without solving the mystery, and if these queer people were, as they must be, fugitives from justice, they could not prosecute me for trespass, whilst, should they prove aggressive, I still had my ash plant and a strong arm. By this time, the great storm, which had gathered so speedily since I set out, began to break, and after a preliminary flash and distant rumble of thunder, a deluge of rain poured out of the sulphurous skies, its impact on the surrounding trees making a sullen, monotonous roar, above which I could still faintly hear the thumps of the child playing in the upstairs room, and its shrill "Tata! Tata!" My own muffled footfalls were quite inaudible, and so, hastening them, I stood a few seconds later on the almost pitch-dark landing outside the half-open door of the room from which the noise was coming. There was more light inside the room than in the hall below, the surrounding trees on that side of the house being somewhat stunted, and I could see quite distinctly the half that was visible through the doorway. Like the rest of the place, it was totally unfurnished, but close against the wall to the right, I noticed with astonishment a tumbled heap of carcasses of what appeared to be hens, rabbits, and other small creatures, furred or feathered, some just like white skeletons, but others more or less lately killed and strangely gashed and mutilated. A disgusting odour of rottenness emanated from the heap, and the floorboards all around seemed to be streaked with great gouts of blood. I think it was at this juncture that I felt my first thrill of real horror, as I asked myself into what hellhole I had wandered, where a little child played among the putrid bodies of birds and beasts, and there was still no sign of parent or nurse, depraved beyond all measure though such a person must be. But the sight that met me, as I at last nerved myself to peer furtively through the crack of the hinge, was the most weirdly unbelievable of all. Seated in the middle of the floor, with its back to me, was the naked figure of a baby of perhaps 2 years, prattling wordlessly in its sing-song treble, as it played with a pile of gleaming white objects arranged about it in a circle. One of these, a globular thing of peculiar configuration, it grasped in its right hand and banged down noisily among the rest. Opposite, just discernible in a shadowy corner, sat the largest brindled cat I had ever seen, dreamily watching the play through half-closed, flame-yellow eyes. I suppose it must have been many minutes that I stood there, dumbfounded, staring at this incredible spectacle, before my dazed senses registered its full hideousness. And then a strangled gasp escaped me, for I saw that the toy in the child's hand was a tiny human skull, and that all the other white things were the various bones of an infant skeleton. Slight as it had been, my involuntary intake of breath broke the spell that had enfolded that dreadful room. With a hellish scream, the cat leapt to the open door, glared at me in bestial rage, and bounded past me down the stairs, whilst the child dropped the skull and sprang with almost equal agility to the heap of rotting carcasses. There it paused, and with no further sign of panic, slowly turned its face to mine. That was not only the most ghastly moment of my life, but the most faith-killing. I would not have believed it possible for such stark fear to engulf a human mind without destroying it. One can visualize the malignant expression of a brute desperado who never knew care or kindness, making his last stand for life. One can picture him equally unleashing all his lust, malice and cruelty on defenseless women in time of revolution, and one only looks at him with anger and loathing, tempered, if one is very, very just, by pity that his loving child soul was crushed before it could develop. Somehow, one always knows, pretty fancies apart, that he was once a child, loving and asking for love. This thing that confronted me in that place of death was spawn of hell, a foul thing, the greatest contradiction of faith that human eyes have ever beheld. It had the body of a child and the expression of the most frightful fiend. As I watched, petrified with terror, these thoughts tumbling tumultuously through my brain, I saw its malignant eyes light up with an unholy inner glow of triumph, and I saw one of its miniature hands delve down into the carcasses and come back bloody and holding a filthy old common kitchen knife. It gave a little babyish chuckle, infinitely horrible, and began to crawl towards me. And in the same moment, I knew by some strange sense, without daring to look, that the great cat was creeping stealthily up the stairs behind me, its head swinging from side to side, and its baleful yellow orbs fixed with dreadful purpose on the back of my head. Shrieking like a frightened beast, I sprang backwards, twisting in the air as I went, and the next thing I can remember is running on and on in a drenching rain down one of the forest paths, whipping my face to ribbons on the thorns and nearly bursting my tortured lungs. They told me when I was better that I said nothing understandable during my period of delirium, for I do not know if what I saw was a spirit or an unthinkable survival. That of the fifth child, born as the woman passed through the wood on her way to death on the moor. After all, chickens feed themselves from the moment of hatching. The fact to be remembered is, however, that I will not divulge the real name of the place, for if I did, I should somehow be compelled to join another search party. And I could not bear to look at the child again.
everybody dies, and it's funny how, isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do they come back? What's the secret?
So that was The Child by L.A. Lewis, Leslie Allen Lewis, born 1899 in Sheffield, died 1961, the year I was born. He was the only child of Arthur Henry Lewis, a brewer, and Catherine Mary Ann Allen. So it was quite common, I think, to take your mother's name as a middle name in those days. I think, yeah, my stepfather had a middle name Wilson, because that was his mother's name. And anyway, there we go. So his early life was spent on the Allen family estate at East Hendred in Berkshire, and he received his education at Royce's School in Abingdon, now known as Abingdon School. Even as a young boy, he displayed a creative streak, writing and illustrating stories about a panther called Blackie. During the First World War, Lewis joined the Artist Rifles and trained as a pilot, earning a certificate as a flyer in 1917. After the war, he pursued further studies in aeroengineering and obtained an instructor's license. So he was interested in flying, and this comes through in some of his stories. His father, we don't know tons about him, but his father seems to have died in about 1925, and he moved with his mother to live with her family in the Finchley area of London. And then he joined the RAF in the Second World War. Before that, he published a story in 1929 because he was writing all the time called The Chords of Chaos and the Theosophist. Now, I'm not going to go into what theosophy was, but it was like a New Age type religion before they had New Age religions. It was a mix of Eastern Hinduism and Buddhism with a dose of Christian mysticism and occult, Western occult stuff. And gave birth to all sorts of later occult societies. Madame Blavatsky was the famous name of theosophy, but Annie Besant as well. You can still find books on theosophy. I think it's still a thing, to be honest. So it indicates his interest in the occult, and I thought that was interesting, given that he starts off by saying he's not a member of the Psychical Research or hasn't written any books on the occult, and I think he was interested in that kind of thing, which comes through in the story. He only produced a single collection of stories, Tales of the Grotesque, 1934, and I think we would definitely say that this is not. This is a step up from M.R. James in that, I don't mean in quality, although I didn't think it was a bad story at all. I thought it was very nicely written. It was very easy to narrate, but it's not a ghost story. M.R. James can be quite horrific, but he's not gory, whereas this is bordering on the gory stories that we would later come in to find in the panned book of horror stories edited by what's his now, Van Taal, Herbert Van Taal. The name escapes me at the moment. I think that's right though. So he has a story called the Tower of Moab, which is about demon-haunted headquarters of an unusual sect, the Tower of Moab is very well received in people who like that kind of pulpy, weird fiction, amazing tales sort of thing, which I'm one of them, to be honest. So he had an interest in the occult, let's say. So he only produced one volume of stories, but they were well regarded, and I got this story from an anthology called by Hugh Lamb, put together by Hugh Lamb in 1973, called A Wave of Fear, and I've got a lot of good stories from that. But as is characteristic of the 70s, we're talking about horror stories, not completely, but they're becoming more horrific rather than just plain ghost stories. He died in 1961. My notes say he had a heart attack while he was in hospital, but I don't have very much detail about it at all. We don't know much about him at all. Well, other people may do, but I've never able to find much about him. So this story, The Child, was part of his Tales of the Grotesque in October 1934, and it has been anthologized. The Tales of the Grotesque has been printed. You can actually find, like the Folio Society, I'm not sure it's them, but you can find kind of deluxe editions, hand-stitched illustrations, so it's a well-regarded book. Okay. And I think, he's been anthologized, I think I said that. So, let's talk about, there are four things, I'm trying to be disciplined, there are four things I want to talk about in relation to this story. And the first is the cult of the child. I'm going to kind of gallop through them as I always do. So the cult of the child. Why is that, the cult of the child? You've got to think about earlier times, Middle Ages, right up through 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Life was short and hard. So if you had children, you got them to work. There was no romanticising of the child. The child would work and work hard from an early age. Even doing jobs with the small size of the child, they made it specially fitted for, such as being a chimney sweeper, of course, until that was banned. And then the Victorians get all sentimental about children's rights, and they stop them going down the pits and climbing up chimneys and doing horrible things. And obviously, I think that was a good thing, in case you didn't get the irony or the joke in the voice. It's not a joke, is it? But I wasn't being completely serious when I said it was such a good thing, you know, just in case I'm very literal-minded. So, yeah, and then they come up with this idea, and it's in Dickens as well, and a lot of Victorian, the flower fairies and all this kind of stuff. There's this cult of the innocent child. So the child goes from being just a small person to having a special status as an innocent, curly-haired, sort of wonderful creature that comes into the world pure. And of course this is against Christian doctrine, which tells us we come in as sinners. We have the mark of Cain on us, don't we? We have original sin on us when we come into the world. So the Victorians in their cult of the child have kind of gone against this and have this idea of, I don't have to labour it, but if you examine it, you see the child is considered this innocent, beautiful, wonderful thing. So roll on a few decades, and as is inevitable, people start to subvert that. You set up a holy cow, probably mixing my metaphors there, and initially what happens is, I said this, it's on the tip of my tongue. Look at Teslas, yeah? Holy cow. So the Tesla car, I'm not talking about your man Elon, I'm talking about the car, the electric car. Tesla is lauded as, this is going to save the planet, this is going to be so fantastic, it's going to save the planet. And then, as with everything that is set up as being wonderful, roll on a bit and people start, in this case, setting them on fire. Now, interestingly, there was a case in London where Just Stop Oil attacked a Tesla dealership. You're like, that is paradoxical, really, because probably Tesla, for all their faults, have done more in the West to promote electric cars, whether you think electric cars are good or bad or indifferent. But if you take it that, we thought the word on the street was electric cars were great, and we're all going to be driving electric cars. The government's going to ban petrol and diesel cars in the UK in the 2030s, 2035, I think, on new ones anyway. So electric cars are deemed to be the future, and they're going to save the planet. And then Just Stop Oil, who's against petrol cars, starts burning electric cars. I think they just threw paint, to be fair. But that's weird. So that's a slight digression. Probably got you spluttering in your coffee, whichever political side you're on. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? But the point is, the cult of the child. The children are set up as wonderful, and then we have stories like this who use that to create extra horror. So we've got this idea of the innocent, beautiful child, which is, in fact, in this story, it's a monster. So, and of course we have Henry James is the turn of the screw when we see this. The two children, particularly the boy, they're sort of wicked evil, aren't they? And I think, that is certainly one example of it. And of course, later on we have William Golding's The Lord of the Flies, and those children are really unpleasant, So, but I think this is an example of that subversion of the proclaimed innocence of the child. The child is going to be everything. I don't think you should go and set them on fire, all right? That's a joke as well. I'm not inciting anything like that. In fact, I'm telling you not to do it. So just bloody stop it. If you were thinking of it, stop it now. All right, let's move on. Ghosts. Second point I want to talk about is lingering ghosts. So another convention is, we see it in Hamlet. Is it happening in the Bible? I don't know. But it goes back. The Greeks have it. The Greeks have it. I should have looked this up. But anyway, certainly in Hamlet, let's stick with Shakespeare. Don't shoot Shakespeare down now. I know he's going... Shakespeare, he's been banned by his own people. Apparently, the Shakespeare Society are saying what a, monster he was in lots of ways. You'll have to look at that yourself. Because I'm already in hot water. So, these attitudes, yeah? So, anyway, so let's just stick to Hamlet. He's father's ghost comes and says, you know, look at this, it's bad crack. You've got to wrong it. And so this idea is a really old one that ghosts will linger in the countryside to point out. The function of ghosts has changed over the years because in Elizabethan times their main job was to point out treasure, because the diggers in Elizabethan times were a real plague. They were looking for treasure, digging up archaeological remains, looking for treasure. That was the big deal. It was very common to be a digger. It's like playing the lottery now, really. You're not going to win, but you're just going to... at best it's futile. At worst it's destructive. So anyway, being controversial today. And then they get this job of, which I've always had a bit of, saying, you know, hey, wrongs have been done, I need you to right them. So, okay, that's the lingering ghost. So, but I think what Lewis does really well, he misdirects us, doesn't he? We have the classic English village, it's beautiful. You're sitting in the pub garden. It's a lovely warm June day. There's birds singing. You've got a pint of homemade ale made brewed locally. You've probably got a bread and cheese. I read L.T.C. Rote's book about how he started off on the canals, and he has this beautiful scene where probably in the 30s him and his missus go and find this idyllic pub where they have their own bread and cheese and ale, and it's like the English dream, you know. Probably particularly an English dream, actually, of this unspoiled countryside where honest people live doing clean things. And so this is how he sets it up, and then we get the classic ghost story of all the bad things happening in that woods stuff, but I'm not going to tell you what. And then she does tell him. And there we go. And so we immediately, the first things, we set up for ghosts, aren't we? So we set us up for ghosts, and that's a misdirection because it's not a ghost. Is it a ghost? Might be a ghost, but I think he sets us up for ghosts, and then he says, nah, tell you what it is next. It's a feral child. And then we go, oh, goodness me, so the child was born and left to fend for itself. And we've got, you know, Romulus and Remus in Rome. We've got Mowgli in Kipling's The Jungle Book. This idea that children can be raised by beasts, in this case a big cat, and they catch their own chickens, because a ghost isn't going to come in your garden and steal your chickens. With this monstrous... It's hard to know how the monstrous child will get across the fence and stuff like that. Let's not get into that. But it is a monstrous child, isn't it? So that leads us on to the second... That's the second misdirection. The first is it's a ghost. No, it's not a ghost. Second is it's a feral child. No, it's not a feral child. Because how could it do those things? And then the third thing is, returning to what we said at the beginning, it is demonic. And the presence of the baleful-eyed yellow cat. Cats are often considered supernatural creatures, or aware of the supernatural, aren't they? I mean, you know, the witch is familiar, but also consider my cat Jeffrey, who is electric against... I've talked about this problem. You have to look at it yourself. I haven't got time now. I haven't got time. I've got to go and do something else. So, yeah, the demonic cat. And so I think the third alternative is that it's a demon, it's demonic, and I think when it picks up the knife and it crawls towards him, it is absolutely demonic, and he sees so he talks about how, you know, even the most awful human desperado, we know that person was a child once and was innocent, harking back to this idea of the innocent child, this Victorian idea, and therefore needed love and protection. I mean, I think we still got that idea. It's not a bad thing, protecting children, okay? I think it's a good thing. I'm going on the record for that. But in this case, that isn't present, so it's othered, isn't it? It's dehumanized. It's not human at all. It's a demon, and the fact that it's in partnership with this massive cat also suggests there's some kind of demonic force in play. And this ties back to what we know about his interest in, his probable interest in the occult. He almost says it, doesn't he? And we know from what little we know of his life. And then we kind of, the question arose to me, well, what if this is a demonic situation? Usually what you find, look at the Amityville Horror. The Amityville Horror starts with a murder in that house, and that is seen as there needs to be some sin that lets the demon in. Right? There's some terrible sin, and I think the sin in this story is the mother's uncaring. She is the greatest sin for a woman is not to love and protect her children. I've talked about this before. The greatest sin for a man is to be a coward and not protect his family. that is the unforgivable sin. The unforgivable sin for a woman is not to love the fruit of her loins. And this is what she's guilty of. And also, added to that, she's mean with money, she's disparaging of her husband, she's probably promiscuous, hence all the children, and because I think when the last one was born, the husband's already dead, so that is the implication, isn't it? So all those terrible things that they say about this woman, is that the sin that lets the demon in? I think it might be. But she's also insane. So that's another interesting. We talk about the child being innocent. We look at the desperado and we see the child. We forgive the child, forgive the monster, the man in front of us, the evil man in front of us doing evil things. I always used to say to my patients when I was working, they'd come in and go, I'm really bad. And I would joke with them, what have you done that's bad? You hit old ladies, you steal cats' food, you go into the church and rob the poor box. And they would go, no, I don't do that. And then they would give them some ridiculous thing. Well, I'm bad because, and they didn't really know why they were bad. And I said to them, even if you were bad, test me on this one. A bad person is someone that does bad things. As soon as they start doing good things, they're no longer a bad person. So you may have done terrible things in the past, but as soon as you start doing good things, you're no longer bad. Yeah, that's what I think. I accept that could be challenged. But that is my rule of thumb. But she didn't stop. Oh yeah, okay. So we're talking about how the bad man is absolved in a small way because he was an innocent child. The other way of absolving somebody from wickedness is by painting them as being insane. So say example today, I'm not going to do this. I'm not saying it's a good thing. Say I go and I find an old lady with her walking from, and I push her over in front of the car. I'm not going to do that. So don't get upset. I'm not going to do it. I think it's a dreadful thing to do. But say I did do it, and the police come, and if I just done it because I'm a bad piece of work, they'd batter me, handcuff me, send me to jail, and I'd be punished. Correctly, probably. Now, if I said a voice in my head, and I wasn't lying just to get off the charge, it was true, told me to do it, they go, they wouldn't batter me, they'd probably still handcuff me. They would take me to a hospital where I'd be treated, because in the second, I'm considered innocent. It's not me that did it, it's some mysterious force, i.e. madness. This is very interesting. Remember I've talked about how the Greeks, particularly the Homeric Greeks, they felt that when you had an emotion, say you fell in love, you were possessed by the goddess Aphrodite. Mars would possess you to anger, They believed that Jupiter was the sky, and Jupiter is crying, because, so it was all personified. So it was felt that okay, the sky is not a human thing, but say emotions were the results of the possessions of God, so you weren't responsible for them. It was still this idea. I mean, there used to be this series called Crimes of Passion that was about France. We always consider, people in Britain always consider, potentially not the Scots, they always get on with the French. I like the French as well, just saying. But people can misconstrue stuff. You just say something. But anyway, I'm a Francophile. And, so they would have this crime of passion whereby if you murdered somebody out of passion, it wasn't treated as severely, and it wasn't punished as severely. So there is this idea that if we are possessed by an emotion beyond our control, we are not as morally culpable for it. And that's true with madness. And so I wonder whether the madness of the woman is a way of letting her off the hook. Yes, she was a horrible bitch, but she was mad. So it wasn't all her fault. She deserves treatment, not punishment. Now, the final point I want to make is the equivalence of madness and demonic possession. Now, we know that in certain cultures, there have been court cases about this. It's still considered that what we in the clinical West would call psychosis, and even epilepsy in earlier days was considered as some kind of possession by an outside demonic force. And we have the Gerasene swine, don't we, in the Bible, where there's this man who's clearly mad, living in a graveyard, injuring himself, doing things that psychiatric patients do today. He is possessed by a demon, which Christ then casts out. So this equivalence, and people who had epilepsy would fall to the ground, and we know that's a neurological condition, but it was certainly this feeling that there was some kind of evil associated with it. People are frightened of it. People are frightened of unpredictable behaviour, and so what we're frightened of, we tar up as evil, don't we? So that's a whole PhD subject. Probably nobody would be brave enough to do at the moment. But to talk about, we could do if we condemned it thoroughly, this equivalence of insanity and evil. Yeah? Not because demons are just a proxy for evil. So, you can say, in the same way we said about the Greek gods, he's possessed by a demon, therefore he's doing evil things. But what if we say that the insanity itself is equivalent to evil? And I'm not saying it is. I'm definitely not saying it is. But I think it would be interesting to look historically and psychologically at why people might think that. Why? And I would put it down to the fact that when people behave in an irrational, violent manner, we're really frightened of them. And so what we're frightened of we call evil. Yeah? Anyway, lots of interesting things we can pull out of that one, but that's about all I've got time for because I can hear my doggy woggy wogs coming up the stairs. I've been really worried about Jasper's paw, and for saying that, but it's looking like it's healing, so thank you for all your prayers and the other stuff you're doing. Sheila's friends were sending kind of new age healing. I was saying a few prayers, and it seems to be on the mend, so thank you for that. So I'm so relieved. Yeah, thank you. Is time an endless ocean? Randolph Carter, armed with a silver key, set sail across its fathomless depths. His quest? The ultimate truth. But the waters are treacherous, and the shores lead to alien worlds and entities beyond human reckoning. What the journey reveals will challenge Carter's understanding of everything. Listen now to H.P. Lovecraft and E. Hoffman Price's Strange Tale. My name is Tony Walker, and I am the narrator of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast. This episode was kindly sponsored by Gavin Critchley.
Everybody dies, and so do you. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do they come back? What's the secret?
Through the Gates of the Silver Key by H.P. Lovecraft. 1. In a vast room hung with strangely figured arras and carpeted with bonchata rugs of impressive age and workmanship, 4 men were sitting around a document-strewn table. From the far corners, where odd tripods of wrought iron were now and then replenished by an incredibly aged Negro in sombre livery, came the hypnotic fumes of olibanum, while in a deep niche on one side there ticked a curious coffin-shaped clock whose dial bore baffling hieroglyphs and whose 4 hands did not move in consonance with any time system known on this planet. It was a singular and disturbing room, but well fitted to the business then at hand. For there, in the New Orleans home of this continent's greatest mystic, mathematician and Orientalist, there was being settled at last the estate of a scarcely less great mystic, scholar, author and dreamer who had vanished from the face of the earth 4 years before. Randolph Carter, who had all his life sought to escape from the tedium and limitations of waking reality in the beckoning vistas of dreams and fabled avenues of other dimensions, disappeared from the sight of man on the 7th of October 1928 at the age of 54. His career had been a strange and lonely one, and there were those who inferred from his curious novels many episodes more bizarre than any in his recorded history. His association with Harley Warren, the South Carolina mystic who studies in the primal Nakal language of the Himalayan priests, had led to such outrageous conclusions, had been close. Indeed, it was he who, one mist-mad, terrible night in an ancient graveyard, had seen Warren descend into a dank and nitrous vault. never to emerge. Carter lived in Boston, but it was from the wild, haunted hills behind hoary and witch-accursed Arkham that all his forebears had come. And it was amid these ancient, cryptically brooding hills that he had ultimately vanished. His old servant Parks, who died early in 1930, had spoken of the strangely aromatic and hideously carven box he had found in the attic, and of the indecipherable parchments and queerly figured silver key which the box had contained, matters of which Carter had also written to others. Carter, he said, had told him that this key had come down from his ancestors, and that it would help him unlock the gates to his lost boyhood and to strange dimensions and fantastic realms which he had hitherto visited only in vague, brief and elusive dreams. Then, one day, Carter took the box and its contents and rode away in his car, never to return. Later on, people found the car at the side of an old grass-grown road in the hills behind crumbling Arkham, the hills where Carter's forebears had once dwelt, and where the ruined cellar of the great Carter homestead still gaped to the sky. It was in a grove of tall elms nearby that another of the Carters had mysteriously vanished in 1781, and not far away was the half-rotted cottage where Goody Fowler the witch had brewed her ominous poison still earlier. The region had been settled in 1692 by fugitives from the witchcraft trials in Salem, and even now it bore a name for vaguely ominous things scarcely to be envisaged. Edmund Carter had fled from the shadow of Gallows Hill just in time, but the tales of his sorceries were many. Now, it seemed, his lone descendant had gone somewhere to join them. In the car, they found a hideously carved box of fragrant wood and a parchment which no man could read. The silver key was gone, presumably with Carter. Further than that, there was no certain clue. Detectives from Boston said that the fallen timbers of the old Carter place seemed oddly disturbed, and somebody found a handkerchief on the rock-ridged, sinisterly wooded slope behind the ruins near the dreaded cave called the Snake Den. It was then that the country legends about the Snake Den gained a new vitality. Farmers whispered of the blasphemous uses to which old Edmund Carter the wizard had put that horrible grotto, and added later tales about the fondness which Randolph Carter himself had had for it when a boy. In Carter's boyhood, the venerable gambrel-roofed homestead was still standing and tenanted by his great-uncle Christopher. He had visited there often and talked singularly about the Snake Den. People remembered what he had said about a deep fissure and an unknown inner cave beyond, and speculated on the change he had shown after spending one whole memorable day in the cavern when he was 9. That was in October too, and ever after that he had seemed to have an uncanny knack at prophesying future events. It had rained late in the night that Carter vanished, and no one was quite able to trace his footprints from the car. Inside the Snake Den, all was amorphous liquid mud owing to the copious seepage. Only the ignorant rustics whispered about the prints they thought they spied where the great elms overhang the road, and on the sinister hillside near the Snake Den where the handkerchief was found. Who could pay attention to whispers that spoke of stubby little tracks like those which Randolph Carter's square-toed boots made when he was a small boy? It was as crazy a notion as that other whisper, that the tracks of old Benijah Corley's peculiar heelless boots had met the stubby little tracks in the road. Old Benijah had been the Carter's hired man when Randolph was young, but he had died 30 years ago. It must have been these whispers, plus Carter's own statement to Parks and others, that the queerly arabesqued silver key would help him unlock the gates of his lost boyhood, which caused a number of mystical students to declare that the missing man had actually doubled back on the trail of time and returned through 45 years to that other October day in 1883, when he had stayed in the Snake Den as a small boy. When he came out that night, they argued he had somehow made the whole trip to 1928 and back, For did he not thereafter know of things which were to happen later? And yet he had never spoken of anything to happen after 1928. One student, an elderly eccentric of Providence, Rhode Island, who had enjoyed a long and close correspondence with Carter, had a still more elaborate theory and believed that Carter had not only returned to boyhood, but achieved a further liberation, roving at will through the prismatic vistas of boyhood dream. After a strange vision, this man published a tale of Carter's vanishing, in which he hinted that the lost one now reigned as king on the opal throne of Ilek-Vad, that fabulous town of turrets, atop the hollow cliffs of glass overlooking the twilight sea, wherein the bearded and finny Nori build their singular labyrinths. It was this old man, Ward Phillips, who pleaded most loudly against the apportionment of Carter's estate to his heirs, all distant cousins, on the ground that he was still alive in another time dimension and might well return someday. Against him was arrayed the legal talent of one of the cousins, Ernest K. Aspinwall of Chicago, a man 10 years Carter's senior, but keen as a youth in forensic battles. For 4 years the contest had raged, but now the time for apportionment had come, and this vast, strange room in New Orleans was to be the scene of the arrangement. It was the home of Carter's literary and financial executor, the distinguished Creole student of mysteries and Eastern antiquities, Etienne Laurent de Marigny. Carter had met de Marigny during the war when they both served in the French Foreign Legion, and had at once cleaved to him because of their similar tastes and outlook. When, on a memorable joint furlough, the learned young Creole had taken the wistful Boston dreamer to Bayonne in the south of France, and had shown him certain terrible secrets in the nighted and immemorial crypts that burrow beneath that brooding, aeon-weighted city, the friendship was forever sealed. Carter's will had named de Marigny as executor, and now that avid scholar was reluctantly presiding over the settlement of the estate. It was sad work for him, for, like that old Rhode Islander, he did not believe that Carter was dead. But what weight had the dreams of mystics against the harsh wisdom of the world? Around the table in that strange room in the old French Quarter sat the men who claimed an interest in the proceedings. There had been the usual legal advertisements of the conference in papers wherever Carter's heirs were thought to live, yet only 4 now sat listening to the abnormal ticking of that coffin-shaped clock which told no earthly time, and to the bubbling of the courtyard fountain beyond half-curtained, fan-lighted windows. As the hours wore on, the faces of the 4 were half shrouded in the curling fumes from the tripods, which, piled recklessly with fuel, seemed to need less and less attention from the silently gliding and increasingly nervous old Negro. There was Etienne de Marigny himself, a slim, dark, handsome, moustached and still young. Aspinall, representing the heirs, was white-haired, apoplectic-faced, side-whiskered and portly. Phillips, the Providence mystic, was lean, grey, long-nosed, clean-shaven and stoop-shouldered. The 4th man was non-committal in age, lean, with a dark, bearded, singularly immobile face of very regular contour, bound with the turban of a high-caste Brahmin, and having night-black, burning, almost irisless eyes, which seemed to gaze out from a vast distance behind the features. He had announced himself as the Swami Chandraputra, an adept from Benares, with important information to give, and both de Marigny and Phillips, who had corresponded with him, had been quick to recognize the genuineness of his mystical pretensions. His speech had an oddly forced, hollow, metallic quality, as if the use of English taxed his vocal apparatus, yet his language was easy, correct, and idiomatic as any native Anglo-Saxon's. In general attire, he was the normal European civilian, but his loose clothes sat peculiarly badly on him, while his bushy black beard, Eastern turban, and large white mittens gave him an air of exotic eccentricity. De Marigny, fingering the parchment found in Carter's car, was speaking. "No, I have not been able to make anything of the parchment. Mr. Phillips here also gives it up. Colonel Churchwarden declares it is not Nakal, and it looks nothing at all like the hieroglyphics on that Easter Island War Club. The carvings on the box, though, do strangely suggest the Easter Island images. The nearest thing I can recall to these parchment characters. Notice how all the letters seem to hang down from horizontal word bars. Is writing in a book poor Ali Warren once had. He came from India while Carter and I were visiting him in 1919, and he never would tell us anything about it. Said it would be better if we didn't know, and hinted that it might have come originally from someplace other than the earth. He took it with him in December when he went down into the vault in that old graveyard, but neither he nor the book ever came to the surface again. Some time ago, I sent our friend here, the Swami Chandraputra, a memory sketch of some of those letters and also a photostatic copy of the Carter parchment. He believes he may be able to shed light on them after certain references and consultations. But the key, Carter sent me a photograph of that. Its curious arabesques were not letters, but seem to have belonged to the same culture tradition as the parchment Carter always spoke of, being on the point of solving the mystery, though he never gave details. Once he grew almost poetic about the whole business. That antique silver key, he said, would unlock the successive doors that bar our free march down the mighty corridors of space and time to the very border which no man has crossed since Shaddad, with his terrific genius, built and concealed in the sands of Arabia Petraea the prodigious domes and uncounted minarets of thousand-pillared Eden. Half-starved dervishes, wrote Carter, and thirst-crazed nomads have returned to tell of that monumental portal, and of the hand that is sculptured above the keystone of the arch, but no man has passed and retraced his steps to say that his footprints on the garnet-strewn sands within bear witness to his visit. The key, he surmised, was that for which the Cyclopean sculptured and vainly grasps. Why Carter didn't take the parchment as well as the key, we cannot say. Perhaps he forgot it. Or perhaps he forbore to take it through the recollection of one who had taken a book of like characters into a vault and never returned. Or perhaps it was really immaterial to what he wished to do. As de Marigny paused, old Mr. Phillips spoke, a harsh, shrill voice. "We can know, Randolph Carter's wandering, only what we dream. I have been to many strange places in dreams and have heard many strange and significant things in Utah, beyond the river Sky. It does not appear that the parchment was needed, for certainly Carter re-entered the world of his boyhood dreams and is now a king in Inekvad." Mr. Aspinall grew doubly apoplectic looking as he sputtered, "Can't somebody shut the old fool up? We've had enough of these moanings. The problem is to divide the property, and it's about time we got to it." For the first time, Swami Chandraputra spoke in his queerly alien voice. "Gentlemen, there is more to this matter than you think. Mr. Aspinwall does not do well to laugh at the evidence of dreams. Mr. Phillips has taken an incomplete view, perhaps because he has not dreamed enough. I myself have done much dreaming. We in India have always done that, just as all the Carters seem to have done it. You, Mr. Aspinwall, as a maternal cousin, are naturally not a Carter. My own dreams and certain other sources of information have told me a great deal which you still find obscure. For example, Randolph Carter forgot that parchment which he couldn't decipher, yet it would have been well for him had he remembered to take it. You see, I have really learned pretty much what happened to Carter after he left his car with the silver key at sunset on that 7th of October 4 years ago. Aspinall audibly sneered, but the others sat up with heightened interest. The smoke from the tripods increased, and the crazy ticking of that coffin-shaped clock seemed to fall into bizarre patterns like dots and dashes of some alien and insoluble telegraph message from outer space. The Hindu leaned back, half closed his eyes, and continued in that oddly laboured yet idiomatic speech, while before his audience there began to float a picture of what had happened to Randolph Carter. 2. The hills beyond Arkham are full of a strange magic. Something perhaps which the old wizard Edmund Carter called down from the stars and up from the crypts of Nether Earth when he fled there from Salem in 1692. As soon as Randolph Carter was back among them, he knew that he was close to one of the gates which a few audacious, abhorred and alien-souled men have blasted through Titan walls betwixt the world and the outside absolute. Here he felt, and on this day of the year, he could carry out with success the message he had deciphered months before from the arabesques of that tarnished and incredibly ancient silver key. He knew now how it must be rotated, and how it must be held up to the setting sun, and what syllables of ceremony must be intoned into the void at the ninth and last turning. In a spot as close to a dark polarity and induced gate as this, it could not fail in its primary function. Certainly, he would rest that night in the lost boyhood for which he had never ceased to mourn. He got out of the car with the key in his pocket, walking uphill deeper and deeper into the shadowy core of that brooding, haunted countryside of winding road, vine-grown stone wall, black woodland, gnarled, neglected orchard, gaping windowed, deserted farmhouse, and nameless nun. At the sunset hour, when the distant spires of Kingsport gleamed in the ruddy blaze, he took out the key and made the needed turnings and intonations. Only later did he realize how soon the ritual had taken effect. Then, in the deepening twilight, he had heard a voice out of the past. Old Benijah Corey, his great-uncle's hired man. Had not old Benijah been dead for 30 years? 30 years? Before when? What was the time? Where had he been? Why was it strange that Benijah should be calling him on the 7th of October, 1883? Was he not out later than Aunt Martha had told him to stay? What was this key in his blouse pocket? For his little telescope given him by his father on his 9th birthday 2 months before ought to have been. Had he found it in the attic at home? Would it unlock the mystic pylon which his sharp eye had traced amidst the jagged rocks at the back of that inner cave behind the snake den on the hill? That was the place they always coupled with old Edmund Carter the wizard. People wouldn't go there, and nobody but him had ever noticed or squirmed through the root-choked fissure to that great black inner chamber with the pylon. Whose hands had carved that hint of a pylon out of the living rock? Old wizard Edmund's? Or others that he had conjured up and commanded? That evening, little Randolph ate supper with Uncle Chris and Aunt Martha in the old gambrel-roofed farmhouse. Next morning, he was up early and out through the twisted-boughed apple orchard to the upper timberline where the mouth of the snake den lurked, black and forbidding, amongst grotesque, over-nourished oaks. A nameless expectancy was upon him, and he did not even notice the loss of his handkerchief as he fumbled in his blouse pocket to see if the queer little silver key was safe. He crawled through the dark orifice with tense, adventurous assurance, lighting his way with matches taken from the sitting room. In another moment he had wriggled through the root-choked fissure at the farther end and was in the vast unknown inner grotto whose ultimate rock wall seemed half like a monstrous and consciously shapen pylon. Before that dank dripping wall he stood silent and awestruck, lighting one match after another as he gazed. Was that stony bulge of the keystone of the imagined art really a gigantic sculptured hand? Then he drew forth the silver key and made motions and intonations whose source he could only dimly remember. Was anything forgotten? He knew only that he wished to cross the barrier to the untrammeled land of his dreams, and the gulfs where all dimensions dissolved in the absolute. 3. What happened then is scarcely to be described in words. It is full of those paradoxes, contradictions and anomalies which have no place in waking life, but which fill our more fantastic dreams, and are taken as matters of course till we return to our narrow, rigid, objective world of limited causation and tri-dimensional logic. As the Hindu continued his tale, he had difficulty in avoiding what seemed, even more than the notion of a man transferred through the years to boyhood, an air of trivial, puerile extravagance. Mr. Aspinall, in disgust, gave an apoplectic snort and virtually stopped listening. For the rite of the silver key, as practiced by Randolph Carter in that black, haunted cave within a cave, did not prove unavailing. From the first gesture and syllable, an aura of strange, awesome mutation was apparent. A sense of incalculable disturbance and confusion in time and space, yet one which held no hint of what we recognize as motion and duration. Imperceptibly, such things as age and location ceased to have any significance whatever. The day before, Randolph Carter had miraculously leaped the gulf of years. Now, there was no distinction between boy and man. There was only the entity Randolph Carter, with a certain store of images which had lost all connection with terrestrial scenes and circumstances of acquisition. A moment before, there had been an inner cave with vague suggestions of a monstrous arch and gigantic sculptured hand on the farther wall. Now, there was neither cave nor absence of cave, neither wall nor absence of wall. There was only a flux of impressions, not so much visual as cerebral, amidst which the entity that was Randolph Carter experienced perceptions or registrations of all that his mind revolved on, yet without any clear consciousness of the way in which he received them. By the time the rite was over, Carter knew that he was in no region whose place could be told by Earth's geographers, and in no age whose date history could fix, for the nature of what was happening was not wholly unfamiliar to him. There were hints of it in the cryptical Pnakotic fragments, and a whole chapter in the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hasbeb had taken on a significance when he had deciphered the designs graven on the silver key. A gate had been unlocked. Not indeed the ultimate gate, but one leading from Earth and time to that extension of Earth which is outside time, and from which in turn the ultimate gate leads fearsomely and perilously to the last void which is outside all Earths, all universes, and all matter. There would be a guide, and a very terrible one. A guide who had been an entity of Earth millions of years before, when man was undreamed of, and when forgotten shapes moved on a steaming planet, building strange cities, among whose last crumbling ruins the first mammals were to play. Carter remembered what the monstrous Necronomicon had vaguely and disconcertingly adumbrated concerning that guide. And while there are those, the mad Arab had written, who have dared to seek glimpses beyond the veil and to accept him as guide, they would have been more prudent had they avoided commerce with him, for it is written in the book of Thoth how terrific is the price of a single glimpse. Nor may those who pass ever return. For in the vastnesses transcending our world are shapes of darkness that seize and bind. The affair that shambleth about in the night, the evil that defieth the elder sign, the herd that stand watch at the secret portal each tomb is known to have, and that thrive on that which groweth out of the tenants thereof. All these blacknesses are lesser than he who guardeth the gateway, he who will guide the rash one beyond all worlds into the abyss of unnameable devourers. For he is At-Tawil, the most ancient one, which the scribe rendereth as the prolonged of life. Memory and imagination shaped dim half-pictures with uncertain outlines amidst the seething chaos, but Carter knew that they were of memory and imagination only. Yet he felt that it was not chance which built these things in his consciousness, but rather some vast reality, ineffable and undimensioned, which surrounded him and strove to translate itself into the only symbols he was capable of grasping. For no mind of earth may grasp the extensions of shape which interweave in the oblique gulfs outside time and the dimensions we know. There floated before Carter a cloudy pageantry of shapes and scenes, which he somehow linked with Earth's primal, aeon-forgotten past. Monstrous living things moved deliberately through vistas of fantastic handiwork that no sane dream ever held. And landscapes bore incredible vegetation and cliffs and mountains and masonry of no human pattern. There were cities under the sea and denizens thereof, and towers in great deserts with globes and cylinders, and nameless winged entities shot off into space or hurtled down out of space. All this Carter grasped, though the images bore no fixed relation to one another or to him. He himself had no stable form or position, but only such shifting hints of form and position as his whirling fancy supplied. He had wished to find the enchanted regions of his boyhood dreams, where galleys sail up the river Ukranos past the gilded spires of Thran, and elephant caravans tramp through perfumed jungles and cled. Beyond forgotten palaces with veined ivory columns that sleep lovely and unbroken under the moon. Now intoxicated with wider visions, he scarcely knew what he saw. Thoughts of infinite and blasphemous daring rose in his mind, and he knew he would face the dreaded guide without fear, asking monstrous and terrible things of him. All at once, the pageant of impressions seemed to achieve a vague kind of stabilization. There were great masses of towering stone, carven into alien and incomprehensible designs, and disposed according to the laws of some unknown inverse geometry. Light filtered from a sky of no assignable colour in baffling, contradictory directions, and placed almost sentiently over what seemed to be a curved line of gigantic hieroglyphed pedestals, more hexagonal than otherwise, and surmounted by cloaked, ill-defined shapes. There was another shape, too, which occupied no pedestal, but which seemed to glide or float over the cloudy floor-like lower level. It was not exactly permanent in outline, but held transient suggestions of something remotely preceding or paralleling the human form, though half as large again as an ordinary man. It seemed to be heavily cloaked, like the shapes on the pedestals, with some neutral-coloured fabric, and Carter could not detect any eye-holes through which it might gaze. Probably he did not need to gaze, for it seemed to belong to an order of beings far outside the merely physical in organization and faculties. A moment later, Carter knew that this was so, for the shape had spoken to his mind without sound or language, and though the name it uttered was a dreaded and terrible one, Randolph Carter did not flinch in fear. Instead, he spoke back, equally without sound or language, and made those obeisances which the hideous Necronomicon had taught him to make. For this shape was nothing less than that which all the world has feared since Lomar rose out of the sea, and the children of the fire mists came to earth to teach the elder law to man. It was indeed the frightful guide and guardian of the gate, At-Tawil, the ancient one, which the scribe rendereth the prolonged of life. The guide knew, as he knew all things, of Carter's quest and coming, and that this seeker of dreams and secrets stood before him unafraid. There was no horror or malignancy in what he radiated, and Carter wondered for a moment whether the mad Arab's terrific, blasphemous hints came from envy and a baffled wish to do what was now about to be done. Or perhaps the guide reserved his horror and malignity for those who feared. As the radiations continued, Carter eventually interpreted them in the form of words. "I am indeed that most ancient one," said the guide, "of whom you know. We have awaited you, the ancient ones and I. You are welcome even though long delayed. You have the key and have unlocked the first gate. Now, the ultimate gate is ready for your trial. If you fear, you need not advance. You may still go back unharmed the way you came. But if you chose to advance..." The pause was ominous, but the radiations continued to be friendly. Carter hesitated not a moment, for a burning curiosity drove him on. I will advance," he radiated back, "and I accept you as my guide." At this reply, the guide seemed to make a sign by certain motions of his robe, which may or may not have involved the lifting of an arm or some homologous member. A second sign followed, and from his well-learned lore, Carter knew that he was at last very close to the ultimate gate. The light now changed to another inexplicable color, and the shapes on the quasi-hexagonal pedestals became more clearly defined. As they sat more erect, their outlines became more like those of men, though Carter knew that they could not be men. Upon their cloaked heads there now seemed to rest tall, uncertainly colored mitres, strangely suggestive of those on certain nameless figures chiseled by a forgotten sculptor along the living cliffs of a high, forbidden mountain in Tartary. While grasped in certain folds of their swathings were long scepters, whose carven heads bodied forth a grotesque and archaic mystery. Carter guessed what they were, and whence they came, and whom they served, and guessed too the price of their service, but he was still content, for at one mighty venture he was to learn all. Damnation, he reflected, is but a word bandied about by those whose blindness leads them to condemn all who can see, even with a single eye. He wondered at the vast conceit of those who had babbled of the malignant ancient ones, as if they could pause from their everlasting dreams to wreak a wrath on mankind. As well, he thought, might a mammoth pause to visit frantic vengeance on an angleworm. Now the whole assemblage on the vaguely hexagonal pillars was greeting him with a gesture of those oddly carven scepters and radiating a message which he understood. "We salute you, most ancient one, and you, Randolph Carter, whose daring has made you one of us." Carter saw now that one of the pedestals was vacant, and the gesture of the most ancient one told him that it was reserved for him. He saw also another pedestal, taller than the rest, and at the center of an oddly curved line, neither semicircle nor ellipse, parabola nor hyperbola, which they formed. This, he guessed, was the guide's own throne, moving and rising in a manner hardly definable. Carter took his seat, and as he did so, he saw that the guide had seated himself. Gradually and mistily, it became apparent that the most ancient one was holding something. Some object clutched in the outflung folds of his robe, as if for the sight, or what answered for sight, of the cloaked companions. It was a large sphere, or apparent sphere, of some obscurely iridescent metal, and as the guide put it forward, a low, pervasive half-impression of sound began to rise and fall in intervals which seemed to be rhythmic, even though they followed no rhythm of earth. There was a suggestion of chanting, or what human imagination might interpret as chanting. Presently, the quasi-sphere began to grow luminous, and as it gleamed up into a cold, pulsating light of unassignable color, Carter saw that its flickering conformed to the alien rhythm of the chant. Then, all the mitred, scepter-bearing shapes on the pedestals commenced a slight, curious swaying, in the same inexplicable rhythm, while nimbuses of unclassifiable light resembling that of the quasi-sphere played around their shrouded heads. The Hindu paused in his tale and looked curiously at the tall coffin-shaped clock with the 4 hands and the hieroglyph dial whose crazy ticking followed no known rhythm of earth. "You, Mr. de Marigny," he suddenly said to his learned host, "do not need to be told the particularly alien rhythm to which those cowled shapes on the hexagonal pillars chanted and nodded. You are the only one in America who has had a taste of the outer extension. That clock, I suppose it was sent to you by the yogi poor Harley Warren used to talk about. The seer who said that he alone of living men had been to Yan Ho, hidden legacy of aeon-old lane, and had borne certain things away from that dreadful and forbidden city. I wonder how many of its subtler properties you know. If my dreams and readings be correct, it was made by those who knew much of the first gateway. But let me go on with my tale. At last, continued the Swami, the swaying and the suggestion of chanting ceased. The lambent nimbuses around the now drooping and motionless heads faded, while the cloaked shapes slumped curiously on their pedestals. The quasi-sphere, however, continued to pulsate with inexplicable light. Carter felt that the Ancient Ones were sleeping, as they had been when he first saw them, and he wondered out of what cosmic dreams his coming had aroused them. Slowly, there filtered into his mind the truth that this strange chanting ritual had been one of instruction, and that the companions had been chanted by the most ancient one into a new and peculiar kind of sleep in order that their dreams might open the ultimate gate, to which the silver key was a passport. He knew that in the profundity of this deep sleep they were contemplating unplumbed vastnesses of utter and absolute outsideness, and that they were to accomplish that which his presence had demanded. The guide did not share his sleep, but seemed still to be giving instructions in some subtle, soundless way. Evidently he was implanting images of those things which he wished the companions to dream, and Carter knew that as each of the Ancient Ones pictured the prescribed thought, there would be born the nucleus of a manifestation visible to his earthly eyes. When the dreams of all the shapes had achieved a oneness, that manifestation would occur, and everything he required to be materialized through concentration. He had seen such things on Earth, in India, where the combined projected will of a circle of adepts can make a thought take tangible substance, and in Hori Aklana, of which few men dare speak. Just what the ultimate gate was and how it was to be passed, Carter could not be certain, but a feeling of tense expectancy surged over him. He was conscious of having a kind of body and of holding the fateful silver key in his hand. The masses of towering stone opposite him seemed to possess the evenness of a wall, toward the center of which his eyes were irresistibly drawn, and then, suddenly, he felt the mental currents of the most ancient ones cease to flow forth. For the first time, Carter realized how terrific utter silence, mental and physical, may be. The earlier moments had never failed to contain some perceptible rhythm, if only the faint cryptical pulse of the Earth's dimensional extension. But now, the hush of the abyss seemed to fall upon everything. Despite his intimations of body, he had no audible breath, and the glow of Umar Abtawil's quasi-sphere had grown petrifiedly fixed and unpulsating, a potent nimbus, brighter than those which had played round the heads of the shapes, blazed frozenly over the shrouded skull of the terrible guide. A dizziness assailed Carter, and his sense of lost orientation waxed 1,000-fold. Strange lights seemed to hold the quality of the most impenetrable blackness heaped upon blacknesses, while about the Ancient Ones, so close on their pseudo-hexagonal thrones, there hovered an air of the most stupefying remoteness. Then he felt himself wafted into immeasurable depths, with waves of perfume, warmth, lapping against his face. It was as if he floated in a torrid, rose-tinctured sea, a sea of drugged wine, whose waves broke foaming against shores of brazen fire. A great fear clutched him as he half saw that vast expanse of surging sea lapping against its far-off coast. But the moment of silence was broken. The surgings were speaking to him in a language that was not of physical sound or articulate words. The man of truth is beyond good and evil, intoned the voice that was not a voice. The man of truth has ridden to all is one. The man of truth has learned that illusion is the only reality and that substance is an impostor. And now, in that rise of masonry to which his eyes had been so irresistibly drawn, there appeared the outline of a titanic arch, not unlike that which he thought he had glimpsed so long ago in that cave within a cave, on the far, unreal surface of the three-dimensioned earth. He realized that he had been using the silver key, moving it in accord with an unlearned and instinctive ritual closely akin to that which had opened the inner gate. That rose-drunken sea which lapped his cheeks was, he realized, no more or less than the adamantine mass of the solid wall yielding before his spell, and the vortex of thought with which the ancient ones had aided his spell. Still guided by instinct and blind determination, he floated forward and through the ultimate gate. 4. Randolph Carter's advance through the cyclopean bulk of masonry was like a dizzy precipitation through the measureless gulfs between the stars. From a great distance, he felt triumphant, godlike surges of deadly sweetness, and after that, the rustling of great wings and impressions of sound like chirpings and murmurings of objects unknown on Earth or in the solar system. Glancing backward, he saw not one gate alone, but a multiplicity of gates, at some of which clamoured forms he strove not to remember. And then, suddenly, he felt a greater terror than that which any of the forms could give, a terror from which he could not flee, because it was connected with himself. Even the first gateway had taken something of stability from him, leaving him uncertain about his bodily form and about his relationship to the mistily defined objects around him. But it had not disturbed his sense of unity. He had still been Randolph Carter, a fixed point in the dimensional seething. Now, beyond the ultimate gateway, he realized in a moment of consuming fright that he was not one person, but many persons. He was in many places at the same time. On Earth, on October 7th, 1883, a little boy named Randolph Carter was leaving the snake den in the hushed evening light and running down the rocky slope and through the twisted bowed orchard toward his Uncle Christopher's house in the hills beyond Arkham. Yet, at that same moment, which was also somehow in the earthly year of 1928, a vague shadow, not less Randolph Carter, was sitting on a pedestal among the ancient ones in Earth's transdimensional extension. Here too was a third Randolph Carter in the unknown and formless cosmic abyss beyond the ultimate gate. And elsewhere, in a chaos of scenes whose infinite multiplicity and monstrous diversity brought him close to the brink of madness, was a limitless confusion of beings which he knew were as much himself as the local manifestation now beyond the ultimate gate. There were Carters in settings belonging to every known and suspected age of Earth's history, and to remoter ages of earthly entity, transcending knowledge, suspicion, and credibility. Carters of forms both human and non-human, vertebrate and invertebrate, conscious and mindless, animal and vegetable, and more. There were Carters having nothing in common with earthly life, but moving outrageously amidst backgrounds of other planets and systems and galaxies and cosmic continua, spores of eternal life drifting from world to world, universe to universe, yet all equally himself. Some of the glimpses recalled dreams, both faint and vivid, single and persistent, which he had had through the long years since he first began to dream. And a few possessed a haunting, fascinating and almost horrible familiarity which no earthly logic could explain. Faced with this realization, Randolph Carter reeled in the clutch of supreme horror. Horror such as had not been hinted even at the climax of that hideous night when two had ventured into an ancient and abhorred necropolis under a waning moon, and only one had emerged. No death, no doom, no anguish can arouse the surpassing despair which flows from a loss of identity. Merging with nothingness is peaceful oblivion, but to be aware of existence and yet to know that one is no longer a definite being, distinguished from other beings, that one no longer has a self, that is the nameless summit of agony and dread. He knew that there had been a Randolph Carter of Boston, yet could not be sure whether he, the fragment or facet of an entity beyond the ultimate gate, had been that one, or some other. His self had been annihilated, and yet he, if indeed there could, in view of that utter nullity of individual existence, be such a thing as he, was equally aware of being in some inconceivable way a legion of selves. It was as though his body had been suddenly transformed into one of those many-limbed and many-headed effigies sculptured in Indian temples, and he contemplated the aggregation in a bewildered attempt to discern which was the original and which the additions, if indeed supremely monstrous thought there were any original as distinguished from other embodiments. Then, in the midst of these devastating reflections, Carter's Beyond the Gate fragment was hurled from what had seemed the nadir of horror to black, clutching pits of a horror still more profound. This time it was largely external, a force of personality which at once confronted and surrounded and pervaded him, and which, in addition to its local presence, seemed also to be a part of himself, and likewise to be coexistent with all time and coterminous with all space. There was no visual image, yet the sense of entity and the awful concept of combined localism and identity and infinity lent a paralyzing terror beyond anything which any Carter fragment had hitherto deemed capable of existing. In the face of that awful wonder, the quasi-Carter forgot the horror of destroyed individuality. It was all in one and one in all, a limitless being in self. Not merely a thing of one space-time continuum, but allied to the ultimate animating essence of existence's whole unbounded sweep, the last utter sweep which has no confines and which outreaches fancy and mathematics alike. It was perhaps that which certain secret cults of Earth had whispered of as Yog Sothoth, and which has been a deity under other names, that which the crustaceans of Yoggoth worship as the Beyond One, and which the vaporous brains of the spiral nebulae know by an untranslatable sign. Yet, in a flash, the Carter facet realized how slight and fractional all these conceptions are. And now the being was addressing the Carter facet in prodigious waves that smote and burned and thundered, a concentration of energy that blasted its recipient with well-nigh unendurable violence, and that paralleled in an unearthly rhythm the curious swaying of the ancient ones and the flickering of the monstrous lights in that baffling region beyond the first gate. It was as though suns and worlds and universes had converged upon one point, whose very position in space they had conspired to annihilate with an impact of resistless fury. But amidst the greater terror, one lesser terror was diminished, while the searing waves appeared somehow to isolate the Beyond the Gate Carter from his infinity of duplicates, to restore, as it were, a certain amount of the illusion of identity. After a time, the hearer began to translate the waves into speech forms known to him, and his sense of horror and oppression waned. Fright became pure awe, and what had seemed blasphemously abnormal seemed now only ineffably majestic.
Randolph Carter,
It seemed to say,
my manifestations on your planet's extinction, the ancient ones, have sent you as one who would later return to small lands of dream which you had lost, yet who, with greater freedom, has risen to greater and nobler desires and curiosities. You wish to sail up golden Urkranos, to search out forgotten ivory cities in orchid-headed clay, and to reign on the upper throne of the Lake of Bar, whose fabulous towers of numberless domes rise mighty toward the single red star in a firmament alien to your earth and to all matter. Now, with the passing of 2 gates, you wish loftier things. You would not flee like a child through a scene disliked to a dream beloved, but would plunge like a man into that last and inmost of secrets, which lies behind all scenes and dreams. What you wish, I have found good, and I am ready to grant that which I have granted 11 times only to beings of your planet, 5 times only to those you call men, or those resembling them. I am ready to show you the ultimate mystery, to look on which is to blast a feeble spirit, yet before you gaze full at that last and first of secrets, you may still wield a free choice and return, if you will, through the 2 gates with the veil still unrent before your eye.
5. A sudden shutting off of the waves left Carter in a chilling and awesome silence full of the spirit of desolation. On every hand pressed the illimitable vastness of the void. Yet the seeker knew that the being was still there. After a moment he thought of words whose mental substance he flung into the abyss. I accept. I will not retreat. The waves surged forth again, and Carter knew that the being had heard. And now there poured from that limitless mind a flood of knowledge and explanation which opened new vistas to the seeker and prepared him for such a grasp of the cosmos as he had never hoped to possess. He was told how childish and limited is the notion of a tri-dimensional world, and what an infinity of directions there are besides the known directions of up, down, forward, backward, left, right. He was shown the smallness and tinsel emptiness of the little earth gods, with their petty human interests and connections, their hatreds, rages, loves and vanities, their craving for praise and sacrifice, and their demands for faiths contrary to reason and nature. While most of the impressions translated themselves to Carter as words, there were others to which other senses gave interpretation. Perhaps with eyes, and perhaps with imagination, he perceived that he was in a region of dimensions beyond those conceivable to the eye and brain of man. He saw now, in the brooding shadows of that which had been first a vortex of power, and then an illimitable void, a sweep of creation that dizzied his senses. From some inconceivable vantage point, he looked upon prodigious forms whose multiple extensions transcended any conception of being, size and boundaries which his mind had hitherto been able to hold, despite a lifetime of cryptical study. He began to understand dimly why there could exist at the same time the little boy Randolph Carter in the Arkham farmhouse in 1883, the misty form on the vaguely hexagonal pillar beyond the first gate, the fragment now facing the presence in the limitless abyss, and all the other Carters his fancy or perception envisaged. Then the waves increased in strength and sought to improve his understanding, reconciling him to the multiform entity of which his present fragment was an infinitesimal part. They told him that every figure of space is but the result of the intersection by a plane of some corresponding figure of one more dimension. As a square is cut from a cube, or a circle from a sphere, a cube and sphere of 3 dimensions are thus cut from corresponding forms of 4 dimensions, which men know only through guesses and dreams. And these in turn are cut from forms of 5 dimensions, and so on, up to the dizzy and reachless heights of archetypal infinity. The world of men and of the gods of men is merely an infinitesimal phase of an infinitesimal thing. The 3-dimensional phase of that small wholeness reached by the first gate, where Umar-Apawil dictates dreams to the ancient ones. Though men hail it as reality and brand thoughts of its many-dimensioned original as unreality, it is in truth the very opposite. That which we call substance and reality is shadow and illusion, and that which we call shadow and illusion is substance and reality. Time, the waves went on, is motionless and without beginning or end. That it has motion and is the cause of change is an illusion. Indeed, it is itself really an illusion, for except to the narrow sight of beings in limited dimensions, there are no such things as past, present and future. Men think of time only because of what they call change, yet that too is illusion. All that was and is to be, exists simultaneously. These revelations came with a godlike solemnity which left Carter unable to doubt. Even though they lay almost beyond his comprehension, he felt that they must be true in the light of the final cosmic reality which belies all local perspectives and narrow partial views. And he was familiar enough with profound speculations to be free from the bondage of local and partial conceptions. Had his whole quest not been based upon a faith in the unreality of the local and partial? After an impressive pause, the waves continued, saying that what the denizens of few-dimension zones call change is merely a function of their consciousness, which views the external world from various cosmic angles. As the shapes produced by the cutting of a cone seem to vary with the angles of cutting, being circle, ellipse, parabola or hyperbola according to that angle, yet without any change in the cone itself, so do the local aspects of an unchanged and endless reality seem to change with the cosmic angle of regarding. To this variety of angles of consciousness, the feeble beings of the inner world are slaves, since, with rare exceptions, they cannot learn to control them. Only a few students of forbidden things have gained inklings of this control, and have thereby conquered time and change. But the entities outside the gates command all angles and view the myriad parts of the cosmos in terms of fragmentary, change-involving perspective, or of the changeless totality beyond perspective, in accordance with their will. As the waves paused again, Carter began to comprehend vaguely and terrifiedly the ultimate background of that riddle of lost individuality which had at first so horrified him. His intuition pieced together the fragments of revelation and brought him closer and closer to a grasp of the secret. He understood that much of the frightful revelation would have come upon him, splitting up his ego amongst myriads of earthly counterparts inside the first gate, had not the magic of Umar-Apawil kept it from him in order that he might use the silver key with precision for the ultimate gate's opening. Anxious for clearer knowledge, he sent out waves of thought, asking more of the exact relationship between his various facets. The fragment now beyond the ultimate gate, the fragment still on the quasi-hexagonal pedestal beyond the first gate, the boy of 1883, the man of 1928, the various ancestral beings who had formed his heritage and the bulwark of his ego amid the nameless denizens of the other aeons and other worlds, which that first hideous flash of ultimate perception had identified with him. Slowly, the waves of the being surged out in reply, trying to make plain what was almost beyond the reach of an earthly mind. All descended lines of beings of the finite dimensions, continued the waves, and all stages of growth in each one of these beings are merely manifestations of one archetypal and eternal being in the space outside dimensions. Each local being, son, father, grandfather, and so on, and each stage of individual being, infant, child, boy, man, is merely one of the infinite phases of that same archetypal and eternal being caused by a variation in the angle of the consciousness plane which cuts it. Randolph Carter, at all ages, Randolph Carter and all his ancestors, both human and pre-human, terrestrial and pre-terrestrial, all these were only phases of one ultimate eternal Carter, outside space and time. Phantom projections differentiated only by the angle at which the plane of consciousness happened to cut the eternal archetype in each case. A slight change of angle could turn the student of today into the child of yesterday, could turn Randolph Carter into that wizard Edmund Carter who fled from Salem to the hills behind Arkham in 1692, or that Pickman Carter who in the year 2169 would use strange means in repelling the Mongol hordes from Australia, could turn a human Carter into one of those earlier entities which had dwelt in primal Hyperborea and worshipped black, plastic Tsathoggua after flying down from Chiantville, the double planet that once revolved around Arcturus, could turn a terrestrial Carter to a remotely ancestral and doubtfully shaped dweller on Chiantville itself, or a still remoter creature of transgalactic Shoshni, or a four-dimensional gaseous consciousness in an older space-time continuum, or a vegetable brain of the future on a dark radioactive comet of inconceivable orbit, and so on, in endless cosmic cycle. The archetypes, throbbed the waves, are the people of the ultimate abyss, formless, ineffable, and guessed at only by rare dreamers on the low-dimensioned worlds. Chief among such was this informing being itself, which indeed was Carter's own archetype. The gutless zeal of Carter and all his forebears for forbidden cosmic secrets was a natural result of derivation from the supreme archetype. On every world, all great wizards, all great thinkers, all great artists are facets of it. Almost stunned with awe and with a kind of terrifying delight, Randolph Carter's consciousness did homage to that transcendent entity from which it was derived. As the waves paused again, he pondered in the mighty silence, thinking of strange tributes, stranger questions, and still stranger requests. Curious concepts flowed conflictingly through a brain dazed with unaccustomed vistas and unforeseen disclosures. It occurred to him that if these disclosures were literally true, he might bodily visit all those infinitely distant ages and parts of the universe which he had hitherto known only in dreams, could he but command the magic to change the angle of his consciousness plane. And did not the silver key supply that magic? Had it not first changed him from a man in 1928 to a boy in 1883, and then to something quite outside time? Oddly, despite his present apparent absence of body, he knew that the key was still with him. While the silence still lasted, Randolph Carter radiated forth the thoughts and questions which assailed him. He knew that in this ultimate abyss he was equidistant from every facet of his archetype, human or non-human, terrestrial or extraterrestrial, galactic or transgalactic. And his curiosity regarding the other phases of his being, especially those phases which were farthest from an earthly 1928 in time and space, or which had most persistently haunted his dreams throughout life, was at fever heat. He felt that his archetypal entity could at will send him bodily to any of those phases of bygone and distant life by changing his consciousness plane. Despite the marvels he had undergone, he burned for the further marvel of walking in the flesh through those grotesque and incredible scenes which visions of the night had fragmentarily brought him. Without definite intention, he was asking the presence for access to a dim, fantastic world whose 5 multicolored suns, alien constellations, dizzily black crags, clawed, tapir-snouted denizens, bizarre metal towers, unexplained tunnels, and cryptical floating cylinders had intruded again and again upon his slumbers. That world, he felt vaguely, was in all the conceivable cosmos the one most freely in touch with others, and he longed to explore the vistas whose beginnings he had glimpsed, and to embark through space to those still remoter worlds with which the clawed, snouted denizens trafficked. There was no time for fear. As at all crises of his strange life, sheer cosmic curiosity triumphed over everything else. When the waves resumed their awesome pulsing, Carter knew that his terrible request was granted. If the being was telling him of the nighted gulfs through which he would have to pass, of the unknown quintuple star in an unsuspected galaxy around which the alien world revolved, and of the burrowing inner horrors against which the clawed, snouted race of that world perpetually fought, it told him too of how the angle of his personal consciousness plane and the angle of his consciousness plane regarding the space-time elements of the sought-for world would have to be tilted simultaneously in order to restore to that world the Carter facet which had dwelt there. The presence wanted him to be sure of his symbols if he wished ever to return from the remote and alien world he had chosen. And he radiated back an impatient affirmation, confident that the silver key, which he felt was with him, and which he knew had tilted both world and personal planes into throwing him back to 1883, contained those symbols which were meant, and now the being, grasping his impatience, signified its readiness to accomplish the monstrous precipitation. The waves abruptly ceased, and there supervened a momentary stillness, tense with nameless and dreadful expectancy. Then, without warning, came a whirring and drumming that swelled to a terrific thundering. Once again, Carter felt himself the focal point of an intense concentration of energy which smote and hammered and seared unbearably in the now familiar rhythm of outer space, and which he could not classify as either the blasting heat of a blazing star or the all-petrifying cold of the ultimate abyss. Bands and rays of colour utterly foreign to any spectrum of our universe played and wove and interlaced before him, and he was conscious of a frightful velocity of motion. He caught one fleeting glimpse of a figure sitting alone upon a cloudy throne, more hexagonal than otherwise. 6. As the Hindu paused in his story, he saw that de Marigny and Phillips were watching him absorbedly. Aspinall pretended to ignore the narrative and kept his eyes ostentatiously on the papers before him. The alien-rhythmed ticking of the coffin-shaped clock took on a new and portentous meaning, while the fumes from the choked, neglected tripods wove themselves into fantastic and inexplicable shapes and formed disturbing combinations with the grotesque figures of the draft-swayed tapestries. The old Negro who had tended them was gone. Perhaps some growing tension had frightened him out of the house. An almost apologetic hesitancy hampered the speaker as he resumed in his oddly laboured yet idiomatic voice. "You have found these things of the abyss hard to believe," he said, "but you will find the tangible and material things ahead still harder. That is the way with our minds. Marvels are doubly incredible when brought into 3 dimensions from the vague regions of possible dream. I shall not try to tell you much. That would be another and very different story. I will tell you only what you absolutely have to know." Carter, after that final vortex of alien and polychromatic rhythm, had found himself in what for a moment he thought was his old insistent dream. He was, as many a night before, walking amidst throngs of clawed, snouted beings through the streets of a labyrinth of inexplicably fashioned metal under a plate of diverse solar colour, and as he looked down he saw that his body was like those of the others, rugose, partly squamous, and curiously articulated in a fashion mainly insect-like, yet not without a caricaturish resemblance to the human outline. The silver key was still in his grasp, though held by a noxious-looking claw. In another moment the dream scene vanished, and he felt rather as one just awakened from a dream. The ultimate abyss, the being, the entity of absurd, outlandish race called Randolph Carter, on a world of the future not yet born. Some of these things were parts of the persistent recurrent dreams of the wizard Zakolba on the planet Yavin. They were too persistent. They interfered with his duties in weaving spells to keep the frightful holes in their burrows. and became mixed up with this recollection of the myriad real worlds he had visited in light beam envelopes. And now they had become quasi-real as never before. This heavy material silver key in his right upper claw, exact image of the one he had dreamt about, meant no good. He must rest and reflect and consult the tablets of Mahim for advice on what to do. Climbing a metal wall in a lane off the main concourse, he entered his apartment and approached the rack of tablets. 7-day fractions later, Kalba squatted on his prison in awe and half despair, but the truth had opened up a new and conflicting set of memories. Never more could he know the peace of being one entity. For all time and space, he was two. Kalba, the wizard of Yadith, disgusted with the thought of the repellent earth mammal Carter that he was to be and had been, and Randolph Carter of Boston on the earth, shivering with fright at the clawed mantle thing which he had once been and had become again. The time units spent on Yadith, croaked the Swami, whose laboured voice was beginning to show signs of fatigue, made a tale in themselves which could not be related in brief compass. There were trips to Shoni and Mathura and Keth and other worlds in the 28 galaxies accessible to the light beam envelopes of the creatures of Yadith, and trips back and forth through aeons of time with the aid of the silver key and various other symbols known to Yadith's wizards. There were hideous struggles with the bleached viscous holes in the primal tunnels that honeycombed the planet. There were odd sessions in libraries amongst the masked lore of 10,000 worlds, living and dead. There were tense conferences with other minds of Yadith, including that of the arch-ancient Buor. Kalba told no one of what had befallen his personality, but when the Randolph Carter facet was uppermost, he would study furiously every possible means of returning to the earth and to human form, and would desperately practice human speech with the alien throat organs so ill adapted to it. The Carter facet had soon learned with horror that the silver key was unable to effect his return to human form. It was, as he deduced too late from things he remembered, things he dreamed, and things he inferred from the law of Yadith, a product of Hyperborea on Earth, with power over the personal consciousness angles of human beings alone. It could, however, change the planetary angle and send the user at will through time in an unchanged body. There had been an added spell which gave it limitless powers it otherwise lacked, but this too was a human discovery, peculiar to a spatially unreachable region and not yet to be duplicated by the wizards of Yadith. It had been written on the undecipherable parchment in the hideously carven box with the silver key, and Carter bitterly lamented that he had left it behind. The now inaccessible being of the abyss had warned him to be sure of his symbols, and had doubtless thought he lacked nothing. As time wore on, he strove harder and harder to utilize the monstrous law of Yadith in finding a way back to the abyss and the omnipotent entity. With this new knowledge, he could have done much toward reading the cryptic parchment, but that power, under present conditions, was merely ironic. There were times, however, when the Zakuba facet was uppermost, and when he strove to erase the conflicting Carter memories which troubled him. Thus, long spaces of time wore on, ages longer than the brain of man could grasp, since the beings of Yadith die only after prolonged cycles. After many hundreds of revolutions, the Carter facet seemed to gain on the Zakalba facet, and would spend vast periods calculating the distance of Yadith in space and time from the human Earth that was to be. The figures were staggering aeons of light years beyond the counting, but the immemorial law of Yadith fitted Carter to grasp such things. He cultivated the power of dreaming himself momentarily earthward, and learned many things about our planet that he had never known before. But he could not dream the needed formula on the missing parchment. Then at last he conceived a wild plan of escape from Yadith, which began when he found a drug that would keep his Zakoba facet always dormant, yet without dissolution of the knowledge and memories of Zakoba. He thought that his calculations would let him perform a voyage with a lightwave envelope, such as no being at Yadith had yet performed. A bodily voyage through nameless aeons and across incredible galactic reaches to the solar system and to the Earth itself. Once on Earth, though in the body of a clawed snouted thing, he might be able somehow to find and finish deciphering the strangely hieroglyphed parchment he had left in the car at Arkham, and with its aid and the keys resume his normal terrestrial semblance. He was not blind to the perils of the attempt. He knew that when he had brought the planet angle to the right aeon, a thing impossible to do while hurtling through space, Yadith would be a dead world, dominated by triumphant poles, and that his escape in the lightwave envelope would be a matter of grave doubt. Likewise, he was aware of how he must achieve suspended animation in the manner of an adept to endure the aeon-long flight through fathomless abysses. He knew too that, assuming his voyage succeeded, he must immunize himself to the bacterial and other earthly conditions hostile to a body from Yadith. Furthermore, he must provide a way of feigning human shape on Earth until he might recover and decipher the parchment and resume that shape in truth. Otherwise, he would probably be discovered and destroyed by the people in horror as a thing that should not be. And there must be some gold, luckily obtainable on Yadith, to tide him over that period of quest. Slowly, Carter's plans went forward. He prepared a lightwave envelope of abnormal toughness, able to stand both the prodigious time transition and the unexampled flight through space. He tested all these calculations and sent forth his earthward dreams again and again, bringing them as close as possible to 1928. He practiced suspended animation with marvelous success. He discovered just the bacterial agent he needed and worked out the varying gravity stress to which he must become used. He artfully fashioned a waxen mask and loose costume, enabling him to pass among men as a human being of a sort, and devised a doubly potent spell with which to hold back the beholds at the moment of his starting from dead black Yadith of the inconceivable future. He took care, too, to assemble a large supply of the drugs unobtainable on Earth, which would keep his Zauber facet in abeyance till he might shed the Yadith body. Nor did he neglect a small store of gold for earthly use. The starting day was a time of doubt and apprehension. Carter climbed up to his envelope platform on the pretext of sailing for the Triple Star Nitron and crawled into the sheath of shining metal. He had just room to perform the ritual of the silver key, and as he did so, he slowly started the levitation of his envelope. There was an appalling seething and darkening of the day, and hideous racking of pain. The cosmos seemed to reel irresponsibly, and the other constellations dance in a black sky. All at once, Carter felt a new equilibrium. The cold of interstellar gulfs gnawed at the outside of his envelope, and he could see that he floated free in space, the metal building from which he had started having decayed years before. Below him, the ground was festering with gigantic beholds, and even as he looked, one reared up several 100 feet and levelled a bleached, viscous end at him. But his spells were effective, and in another moment he was falling away from Yadith unharmed. 7. In that bizarre room in New Orleans, from which the old black servant had instinctively fled, the odd voice of Swami Chandraputra grew hoarser still. Gentlemen, he continued, I will not ask you to believe these things until I have shown you a special proof. Accept it then as a myth. When I tell you of the thousands of light years, thousands of years of time, and uncounted billions of miles that Randolph Carter hurtled through space as a nameless alien entity in a thin envelope of electron-activated metal. He timed his period of suspended animation with utmost care, planning to have it end only a few years before the time of landing on the Earth in or near 1928. He will never forget that awakening. Remember, gentlemen, that before that aeon-long sleep he had lived consciously for thousands of terrestrial years amidst the alien and horrible wonders of Yadi. There was a hideous gnawing of cold, a cessation of menacing dreams, and a glance through the eye plates of the envelope. Stars, clusters, nebulae on every hand. And at last their outline bore some kinship to the constellations of Earth that he knew. Someday his descent into the solar system may be told. He saw Kainap and Yugoth on the rim, passed close to Neptune, and glimpsed the hellish white fungi that spotted, learned an untellable secret from the close-glimpsed mists of Jupiter, and saw the horror on one of the satellites, and gazed at the cyclopean ruins that sprawl over Mars's ruddy disk. When the Earth drew near, he saw it as a thin crescent, which swelled alarmingly inside. He slackened speed, though his sensations of homecoming made him wish to lose not a moment. I will not try to tell you of these sensations as I learned them from Carter. Well, toward the last, Carter hovered about in the Earth's upper air, waiting till daylight came over the Western Hemisphere. He wanted to land where he had left, near the snake den, in the hills, behind Arkham. If any of you have been away from home long, and I know one of you has, I leave it to you how the sight of New England's rolling hills and great elms and gnarled orchards and ancient stone walls must have affected you. He came down at dawn in the lower meadow of the old Carter place and was thankful for the silence and solitude. It was autumn, as when he had left, and the smell of the hills was balm to his soul. He managed to drag the metal envelope up the slope of the timber lot into the snake den, though it would not go through the weed-choked fissure to the inner cave. It was there also that he covered his alien body with the human clothing and waxen mask which would be necessary. He kept the envelope here for over a year, till certain circumstances made a new hiding place necessary. He walked to Arkham, incidentally practicing the management of his body in human posture and against terrestrial gravity, and got his gold changed to money at a bank. He also made some inquiries, posing as a foreigner ignorant of much English, and found that the year was 1930, only 2 years after the goal he had aimed at. Of course, his position was horrible. Unable to assert his identity, forced to live on guard every moment with certain difficulties regarding food, and with a need to conserve the alien drug which kept his Acalba facet dormant, he felt that he must act as quickly as possible. Going to Boston and taking a room in the decaying West End where he could live cheaply and inconspicuously, he at once established inquiries concerning Randolph Carter's estate and effects. It was then that he learned how anxious Mr. Aspinall here was to have the estate divided, and how valiantly Mr. Marigny and Mr. Phillips strove to keep it intact. The Hindu bowed, though no expression crossed his dark, tranquil, and thickly bearded face. Indirectly, he continued, Carter secured a good copy of the missing parchment and began working on its deciphering. I am glad to say that I was able to help in all this, for he appealed to me quite early, and through me came in touch with other mystics throughout the world. I went to live with him in Boston, a wretched place in Chambers Street. As for the parchment, I am pleased to help Monsieur de Marigny in his perplexity. To him, let me say, that the language of those hieroglyphics is not Nakal, but Relayan, which was brought to Earth by the spawn of Cthulhu countless ages ago. It is, of course, a translation. There was a Hyperborean original millions of years earlier in the primal tongue of Sathya. There was more to decipher than Carter had looked for, but at no time did he give up hope. Early this year, he made great strides through a book he imported from Nepal, and there is no question but that he will win before long. Unfortunately, however, one handicap has developed. The exhaustion of the alien drug which keeps his Acalba facet dormant. This is not, however, as great a calamity as was feared. Carter's personality is gaining in the body, and when Acalba becomes uppermost for shorter and shorter period, and now only when evoked by some unusual excitement, he is generally too dazed to undo any of Carter's work. He cannot find the metal envelope to take him back to Yadith. And although he almost did once, Carter hid it anew at a time when the Zacalba facet was wholly latent. All the harm he has done is to frighten a few people and create certain nightmare rumors among the Poles and Lithuanians of Boston's West End. So far, he had never injured the careful disguise prepared by the Carter facet, though he sometimes throws it off so that the parts have to be replaced. I have seen what lies beneath hands. It is not good to see. A month ago, Carter saw the advertisement of this meeting and knew that he must act quickly to save his estate. He could not wait to decipher the parchment and resume his human form. Consequently, he deputed me to act for him, and in that capacity, I am here. Gentlemen, I say to you that Randolph Carter is not dead, that he is temporarily in an anomalous condition, but that within 2 or 3 months at the outside, he will be able to appear in proper form and demand the custody of his estate. I am prepared to offer proof if necessary. Therefore, I beg that you will adjourn this meeting for an indefinite period. 8. De Marigny and Phillips stared at the Hindu as if hypnotized, while Aspinall emitted a series of snorts and bellows. The old attorney's disgust had by now surged into open rage, and he pounded the table with an apoplectically veined fist. When he spoke, it was in a kind of bark. How long is this foolery to be borne? I've listened an hour to this madman, this faker, and now he has the damned effrontery to say Randolph Carter is alive? To ask us to postpone the settlement for no good reason? Why don't you throw the scoundrel out, de Marigny? Do you mean to make us all the butts of a charlatan or idiot? De Marigny quietly raised his hand and spoke softly. Let us think here slowly and clearly. This, sir, has been a very singular tale, and there are things in it which I, as a mystic, not altogether ignorant, recognize as far from impossible. Furthermore, since 1930, I have received letters from the Swami which tally with his account. As he paused, old Mr. Phillips ventured a word. Swami Chandra Putra spoke truth. I too recognize much that is significant to this story. And I have myself had many oddly corroborative letters from the Swami during the last 2 years. Some of these statements are very extreme. Is there not something tangible which can be shown? At last, the impassive-faced Swami replied slowly and hoarsely, and drawing an object from the pocket of his loose coat as he spoke, while none of you here has ever seen the silver key itself, Messrs. de Marigny and Phillips have seen photographs of it. Does this look familiar to you? He fumblingly laid on the table, with his large white-mittened hand, a heavy key of tarnished silver, nearly 5 inches long, of unknown and utterly exotic workmanship, and covered from end to end with hieroglyphs of the most bizarre description. De Marigny and Phillips gasped. That's it, cried de Marigny. The camera doesn't lie. I couldn't be mistaken. But Aspinall had already launched a reply. Fools! What does it prove? If that's really the key that belonged to my cousin, it's up to this foreigner, this damned to explain how he got it. Randolph Carter vanished with the key 4 years ago. How do we know he wasn't robbed and murdered? He was half crazy himself and in touch with still crazier people. Look here, you... Where did you get that key? Did you kill Randolph Carter? The Swami's features, abnormally placid, did not change, but the remote, irisless black eyes behind them blazed dangerously. He spoke with great difficulty. Please control yourself, Mr. Aspinall. There is another form of proof I could give, but its effect upon everybody would not be pleasant. Let us be reasonable. Here are some papers obviously written since 1930 in the unmistakable style of Randolph Carter. He clumsily drew a long envelope from inside his loose coat and handed it to the sputtering attorney as de Marigny and Phillips watched with chaotic thoughts and a dawning feeling of supernal wonder. Of course, the handwriting is almost illegible, but remember that Randolph Carter now has no hands well adapted to forming human script. Aspinall looked through the papers hurriedly and was visibly perplexed, but he did not change his demeanor. The room was tense with excitement and nameless dread. and the alien rhythm of the coffin-shaped clock had an utterly diabolic sound to de Marigny and Phillips, though the lawyer seemed affected not at all. Aspinall spoke again. "These look like clever forgeries. If they aren't, they may mean that Randolph Carter has been brought under the control of people with no good purpose. There's only one thing to do. Have this faker arrested, de Marigny. Will you telephone for the police?" "Let us wait," answered their host. "I do not think this case calls for the police. I have a certain idea, Mr. Aspinall. This gentleman is a mystic of real attainments. He says he is in the confidence of Randolph Carter. Will it satisfy you if he can answer certain questions which could be answered only by one in such confidence? I know Carter and can ask such questions. Let me get a book which I think will make a good test." He turned toward the door to the library, Phillips dazedly following in a kind of automatic way. Aspinall remained where he was, studying closely the Hindu who confronted him with abnormally impassive face. Suddenly, as Chandraputra clumsily restored the silver key to his pocket, the lawyer emitted a guttural shout. "Hey, by heaven, I've got it! This rascal is in disguise. I don't believe he's an East Indian at all. That face, it isn't a true face, but a mask. I guess his story put that in my head, but it's true. It never moves. And that turban and beard hide the edges. This fellow's a common crook. He isn't even a foreigner. I've been watching his language. He's a Yankee of some sort. And look at those mittens. He knows his fingerprints could be spotted. Damn you, I'll pull that thing off! Stop!" The hoarse, oddly alien voice of the Swami held a tone beyond all mere earthly fright. "I told you there was another form of proof which I could give if necessary, and I warned you not to provoke me to it. This red-faced old meddler is right. I'm not really an East Indian. This face is a mask, and what it covers is not human. You others have guessed. I felt that minutes ago. It wouldn't be pleasant if I took that mask off. Let it alone. Ernest, I may as well tell you that I am Randolph Carter." No one moved. Aspinall snorted and made vague motions. De Marigny and Phillips across the room watched the workings of the red face and studied the back of the turbaned figure that confronted him. The clock's abnormal ticking was hideous, and the tripod fumes and swaying arras danced a dance of death. The half-choking lawyer broke the silence. "No, you don't, you crook. You can't scare me. You've reasons of your own for not wanting that mask off. Maybe we'd know who you are. Off with it." As he reached forward, the Swami seized his hand with one of his own clumsily mittened members, evoking a curious cry of mixed pain and surprise. De started toward the two, but paused, confused, as the pseudo-Hindu shouted protest, changed to a wholly inexplicable rattling and buzzing sound. Aspinall's red face was furious, and with his free hand he made another lunge at his opponent's bushy beard. This time he succeeded in getting a hold, and at his frantic tug, the whole waxen visage came loose from the turban and clung to the lawyer's apoplectic fist. As it did so, Aspinall uttered a frightful, gurgling cry, and Phillips and de Marigny saw his face convulsed with a wilder, deep, and more hideous epilepsy of stark panic than ever they had seen on human countenance before. The pseudo-Swami had meanwhile released his other hand and was standing as if dazed, making buzzing noises of a most abnormal quality. Then the turbaned figure slumped oddly into a posture scarcely human and began a curious, fascinated sort of shuffle toward the coffin-shaped clock that ticked out its cosmic and abnormal rhythm. His now uncovered face was turned away, and de Marigny and Phillips could not see what the lawyer's act had disclosed. Then their attention was turned to Aspinall, who was sinking ponderously to the floor. The spell was broken. But when they reached the old man, he was dead. Turning quickly to the shuffling Swami's receding back, de Marigny saw one of the great white mittens drop listlessly off a dangling arm. The fumes of the olibanum were thick, and all that could be glimpsed of the revealed hand was something long and black. Before the Creole could reach the retreating figure, old Mr. Phillips laid a hand on his shoulder. "Don't," he whispered. "We don't know what we're up against. That other facet, you know, the Kalber, the Wizard of Yadith." The turbaned figure had now reached the abnormal clock, and the watchers saw through the dense fumes a blurred black claw fumbling with the tall hieroglyph door. The fumbling made a queer clicking sound. Then the figure entered the coffin-shaped case and pulled the door shut after it. De Marigny could no longer be restrained, but when he reached and opened the clock, it was empty. The abnormal ticking went on, beating out the dark cosmic rhythm which underlies all mystical gate openings. On the floor, the great white mitten and the dead man with the bearded mask clutched in his hand had nothing further to reveal. A year has passed, and nothing has been heard of Randolph Carter. His estate is still unsettled. The Boston address from which one Swami Chandra Putra sent inquiries to various mystics in 1930, 31, 32 was indeed tenanted by a strange Hindu, but he left shortly before the date of the New Orleans conference and has never been seen since. He was said to be dark, expressionless and bearded, and his landlord thinks the swarthy mask, which was duly exhibited, looked very much like him. He was never, however, suspected of any connection with the nightmare apparitions whispered of by local Slavs. The hills behind Arkham were searched for the metal envelope, but nothing of the sort was ever found. However, a clerk in Arkham's First National Bank does recall a queer turbaned man who cashed an odd bit of gold bullion in October 1930. De Marigny and Phillips scarcely know what to make of the business. After all, what was proved? There was a story. There was a key which might have been forged from one of the pictures Carter had freely distributed in 1928. There were papers, or indecisive. There was a masked stranger, but who now living saw behind the mask? Amidst the strain and the olibanum fumes, that act of vanishing in the clock might easily have been a dual hallucination. Hindus know much of hypnotism. Reason proclaimed the Swami a criminal with designs on Randolph Carter's estate. But the autopsy said that Aspinall had died of shock. Was it rage alone which caused it? And some things in that story. In a vast room, hung with strangely figured arras and filled with olibanum fumes, Etienne Laurent de Marigny often sits listening with vague sensations to the abnormal rhythm of that hieroglyph, coffin-shaped clock.
Everybody dies. There's something else. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do they come back? What's the secret?
So that was Through the Gates of the Silver Key, which was co-written by H.P. Lovecraft and E. Hoffman Price. And I'd just like to thank Gavin Critchley. Every quarter he sponsors a story for me to do, and just said to me, just pick a Lovecraft story that you like. And I remember reading, I think I'm quite fond of the Randolph Carter tales, so that is The Dream Quest of Unknown Kada, can't speak, but I've just narrated that, so I think I've worn my voice out. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kada and the Silver Key, Through the Gates of the Silver Key, and the final story is The Unnameable. Now, he doesn't know when to stop Lovecraft, does he? I mean, when I was reading it, remember the last long Lovecraft story I did was for last Halloween. I did Dreams in the Witch House, and as I'm an hour and a bit into that, I'm thinking, goodness me, you know, the guy is just throwing words at me, and I feel like a squash player trying to bat them back all the time, you know, and try and get them right. This is a bit like that, but at the beginning I thought, well, actually, particularly the first scene, it's actually relatively normal and rather, you know, sensible. And I think this is true of other visionary artists, and I think possibly Lovecraft was that. We'll talk a bit more about the story, but somebody like the late David Lynch, when he wrote, he'd done Eraserhead and The Elephant Man and then Dune, which they made into a film that he didn't like, but probably made it more digestible for ordinary folk. And then Twin Peaks, which of course was Mark Frost co-wrote with him, and again made it probably more digestible for ordinary folk, because then we get the third season of Twin Peaks, which was mainly him, if not all him, and it was well weird. So I thought that Hoffman Price's influence on Lovecraft was probably a good one here. The prose is certainly purple, and so there are a couple of things that probably wouldn't win him many stars in creative writing class. One is the prose is just too obscure. It's just there. It's just the words are obscure. They're used in a way that's almost comic, and there were a couple of times there that I nearly laughed. And one was how old Aspinall is described as apoplectic. Every time he's mentioned he's apoplectic, he has an apoplectic fist, he does things apoplectically. And then when they're talking about how, at the end about his handwriting, they're saying, well, Randolph Carter's handwriting is almost illegible, and then they point out that he actually doesn't have any hands. So yeah, it would be, really. I mean, you've got an alien claw. How are you going to write? Anyway, never mind. So there were times, and I find that, I'm going to be dead honest with you, I do find that with Pulp Fiction, that sometimes, it gets a bad name, and it's because some of the writing, prose construction is crude. Yeah, let's say it. Let's go out and say it now. I know all you pulp freaks out there are going to go, no, we love it. There's a lot of positive stuff about this story, but Lovecraft's prose is, I guess it's Marmite, isn't it? You either love it or you hate it. Do I hate it? No, I don't actually. I come down in the middle, really. I think it's quite amusing, but I'm not sure that was the effect he was going for. So let's talk about the man himself, Howard Phillips. We've done stories by him before. So he is Mr. Cosmic Horror, and he was born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island. He was only 47. I must like him because I walked from downtown Providence to the graveyard, Swan something, on a really, really hot day, and took ages to find his grave. And as I said before, somebody left him a biro. That is to say, ballpoint pen, a cheap ballpoint pen. I thought he wouldn't have liked that. He'd like something fancy, and he's definitely the guy sitting in the leather armchair, that kind of thing. Anyway, there we go. So his father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, suffered a psychotic episode and was institutionalized from 1893. So he was only 3 years old, and he died in 1898, which was from a disease which was called general paresis, or they used to call it in the UK general paralysis of the insane. And it was late-stage syphilis, which was really, really common. And before, syphilis has been more or less wiped out now. You do get it in some communities, but if it's left unchecked and goes to third stage, it rots your brain. Literally, it eats away at your brain, and you become insane. And the asylums were full of people with syphilis at that time. So it's not, you might think, oh well, Lovecraft, he was crackers as well, but it's not. This isn't something that runs in the family. It's unrelated, so don't think that. I think possibly the trauma, and possibly his neuroticism, which is well known, maybe. I think it's what, neuroticism is one of the big 5 traits that you do inherit. So we don't know what his father was like, but this insanity that he died of, that's not heritable. Anyway, so he was looked after by his mother, Susie Phillips Lovecraft, and his maternal aunts, and his grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips. So he sounds like a real character. He was a surrogate father, really. He introduced it's his grandfather, isn't it, introduced him to the classics, Gothic novels, told weird tales of his own. And Lovecraft was writing and reading by the age of 3. And he wrote poems early on, retelling the Roman and Greek myths. Then, trouble is, Whipple Phillips' business went down the pan, and Then they became poorer and poorer, and his grandmother died in 1896. He's only 6 at this time, and so the family have had a really bad time. And Lovecraft at this time begins experiencing recurring nightmares populated by the unsettling figures he later called night gaunts, and of course they appear in his stories. So you can imagine this is a young boy who has not had much security in life, and you can understand why he would be a nervous child and suffer from anxiety. He was academically good, particularly science, particularly astronomy and chemistry. You see astronomy coming through in this, and published his own scientific periodicals, disseminating his knowledge to a small circle of like-minded individuals. He went into high school in 1904, but was periodically withdrawn for periods due to near breakdowns. This is a young man who's high levels of anxiety and is kind of really struggle to exist in a rough and tough world. He wanted to go to Brown University in Providence, but in 1908 he couldn't graduate from high school because he had a severe and still mysterious health crisis, and it's probably a mental health problem. We don't know. He called it a nervous collapse. So, given what we know of him, I would posit that was what it was. After this, he becomes increasingly reclusive, and he just studies and writes. His mother was very protective. You can understand why she would be of a son who'd lost her father and his beloved grandmother. I don't know if she was beloved, but she was a stability figure in his life. He then, in 1913, so let's calibrate. So he's 23. He writes a letter to Argosy magazine, and it's critical of the pulp magazine, and there's a year-long feud, and this gets him a lot of attention, particularly from the Edward F. Das, editor of the United Amateur Press Association, and he joined that. Lovecraft joins, and therefore he becomes a writer, and he becomes an amateur journalist, and he advocates for archaic English language usage and railing against the vulgarity of commercial writing. You can see all that. He's going to dig out those words. He's going to, nobody knows. The word squamous got in that story again. There was another one with it. I mean, who says squamous? You have squamous cells, but I've never heard of anybody else say the word, apart from when they're mocking him. His first story was in 1916, The Alchemist. And then he produces a steady stream of weird stories: The Tomb, Dagon, Beyond the Wall, Sleep. And even at this stage, it's horror, but it's this cosmic horror. This guy's been interested in astronomy, and the worlds were. And I think this interest in outer space was for most of the 20th century. I remember in the 1970s, fading in the 80s potentially, but it was. That's it. So his mother died in 1921. His mother had a nervous breakdown. It was in 1919, and was sent to the same institute where her husband had died. He was despairing when his mother died, but that's 1921. But he had to. It was a challenge to him to go out into the world and be his own person, or not. So he meets Sonia Green, an older woman with a successful business. His aunts disapproved, but they married in 1924, and he went to New York City. Green believed that Lovecraft needed to leave Providence to flourish, and she was going to support him financially. So when he was there, he became part of an informal group of intellectual and literary friends known as the Calum Club, who encouraged him to submit stories to Weird Tales. And he established friendships with literary figures such as Frank Belknap Long and Samuel Loveman, Edward Baird. Edward Baird, the editor of Weird Tales, accepted many of Lovecraft's stories, including Under the Pyramid, which was ghostwritten by Harry Houdini. So the marriage was short-lived. She soon faced financial difficulties. She moved to Cleveland, leaving Lovecraft in a small, uncomfortable apartment in Red Hook, Brooklyn. So, the horror at Red Hook. He struggled to find employment. He was very unhappy. His experiences during this period fueled his xenophobia and his sense of alienation from modern society. But when he's there, he writes The Horror at Red Hook, and during that time he conceives of the story The Call of Cthulhu, but he didn't write it then. 1926, he returns to Providence, where he moves back in with his aunts. he starts writing The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, The Shadow over Innsmouth, The Shadow Out of Time. Continued to revise works for other authors and ghostwrite stories. Earned a little bit of money, but not much recognition. He wasn't massively recognised during his life. So he had been a conservative, and he became a socialist. He didn't like Marxism, but he didn't like capitalism. And I'm not sure how socialist this is, but he advocates for an intellectual aristocracy, very Platonic, to guide society. He supported Franklin D. Roosevelt in the New Deal, viewing him as the best hope for reform. So in 1933, Sonia Green moved to California and married someone else, unaware that Lovecraft had never officially signed their divorce papers. 1936, The Shadow over Innsmouth was published as paperback books, but there were lots of errors in it and it didn't sell very well. He wrote The Haunter of the Dark, and he found the hostile reception of The Mountains of Madness effectively ended his writing career. And then in 1937 he began experiencing severe abdominal pain, but he was a nervous guy and he was frightened of doctors, and he didn't go and see the doctor, and by the time he did it was too late. He had bowel cancer and he died when he was only 46. Swan Point Cemetery, that's where it was, it's just mentioned here. In 1977 fans erected a headstone in his memory inscribed with his name, dates and the phrase "I am Providence." I mean, he was largely unrecognised in his lifetime. Now, I went to Providence, and one of the reasons I went was Lovecraft, of course. There is an H.P. Lovecraft Square, but it's so small you wouldn't notice it, and there's a sign on it, and there's a bookshop that it's in an arcade, and I really like the bookshop, and it's kind of horror, weird tales. But I would say that many of the modern readers of weird tales and who would frequent that bookshop would be very liberal in their outlook politically, which wasn't Lovecraft. And Providence, with the University, Brown University, is, you know, it probably is ashamed of him, I'm going to say that, because he was famously racist and xenophobic. In that story there, we had Aspinall. So Aspinall calls the Carter, Randolph Carter, who's dressed in an obscure and bizarre wax mask. He calls him the N-word twice. I've never seen this. The paperback producer has redacted that, and they put stars through it. Now, I've never seen that. I've seen words to do with the human body, swear words. They're taboo words, aren't they? And they do that. So when I did, that was me coming across the word and choosing to read it as a redacted word. There we are. It's interesting how reading stories is a choice, isn't it? You know, you make choices, and somebody will write something calling me out on that. Fair enough, it's my choice. Okay, let's talk about this story. So it was penned between October 32 and 33. It's a sequel to The Silver Key, which is a shorter story. So when Gavin asked me to do one, I picked one. I thought about The Silver Key as the first story in sequence, but it's actually not. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath is, but that's really long. It's a novella, really. It's too long. But it was too short. The Silver Key is too short, so I plumped on this one. So Randolph Carter. I've even done the statement of Randolph Carter on the channel, but it was a poor recording. It was one of the first ones I ever did, and it's when his mate Warren disappears. So is it fantasy? Is it horror? Or is it science fiction? Or is it all three? So I think it's all three. There's the fantasy. We have the ancient ones, Umrat Tawil, and fantasy motifs. A lot of the things that fantasy writers like is obscure cities, isn't it? Kadath and R'lyeh and Minas Tirith and all sorts of places. They make all these fantastical places, which are Tanalorn, if you're a Moorcock fan, and they're all obscure and orchid perfumed, and the streets are paved with mother of pearl, and all that kind of stuff. Fantasy, horror. Will we talk about? Might as well talk about it here. So one of the key things of Lovecraftian horror, so I'm going to say something, I was relatively critical of his prose style, but his imagination is stupendous, and he really, we've had gothic horror, we've had vampires, we've had monsters, but this is very clear in this story, is the gross indifference. He talks about an elephant running back angrily to vanquish a fly, and so his horror is the sheer indifference, and I think this parallels that existential angst that was coming upon people in the 19th and 20th century. You think of people like Soren Kierkegaard and, of course, Sartre, the existentialist Camus, although I recently saw him called an absurdist, where the idea is that, and Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, famously said, God is dead and we have killed him, in The Joyous Science, the gay science, it was also translated as, and his point there is we've destroyed our moral framework, we need a new one. I think that's continued to haunt us, I think. And but one of the if you kill your parent, you are both free and unprotected, both at once. This is very Kleinian, Melanie Klein. The object that you love and hate at the same time, you destroy it, and then you are free of it, but it doesn't protect you anymore. So I think that is the dread that comes, this existential dread that Lovecraft, more than anybody, as a fiction writer, I mean, these are the philosophers, they talk about it, Sartre's nausea and all that, this anxiety that comes from feeling alone and your underpinning has gone. Lovecraft, writing produces cosmic horror, which is unlike any kind of horror before it. And it is about that. It is, we live, we exist, yet we live in an indifferent universe that may be hostile to us, it may not be hostile, it may just stomp us like an elephant, and we have absolutely no control over it. And that is one of his great achievements, the breadth of his imagination. I certainly like these fabled cities, and he does that well. Anyway, let's go on. Okay, so other stuff here. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about his conceptualization of time. So we don't really know what time is. We have an experience of time. Time appears to pass, but we can't really explain that. And there are different views about what time is, and none of them might be right. So one of them is presentism. And presentism, and I've come across people who believe this, who believe that there is nothing but now. Memories are of the past, they're imaginary, the dogs have come up to see me. Imagination of the future. The future is imagination, the past is memory. They're both intangible, they are not of the same kind of thing as the present minute. And so the presentist would say they don't actually exist. There is no past, there is no present. I've even come across extreme presentists who say, you're sitting here, I'm sitting here upstairs, there is a kitchen downstairs, except there isn't. What they say is, none of it's real. All of it is just a memory. So that's the extreme presentism. Lovecraft is not that. Yeah, he's not that. So then the other one is the growing block. And this one says that in some sense, the present and the past exist in some sense. I'm not sure how the past exists, but the future is not yet created. I'm coming round to that. I used to be a block universe guy, and so that is to say, simple. And then the other is called eternalism, which is this block universe, which says that everything that ever is or will be exists. This is what Lovecraft's saying. And so he's having quite extended philosophical debate on that. not a debate, an exposition really, he's just setting it forward, that, everything exists, and the boy of his, that he was when he went to the snake den, and the man in 1928, and where he is. So me, who's sitting here now, me and my birthday party when I was 9, me, my first kiss, they all exist still. That's the block universe. None of this can be proven, but I think it's interesting that he brings it forward. Sometimes I feel that, when I said at the beginning that he would be chastised in creative writing classes, and the first reason would be his archaic language, which he championed, but it's not fashionable, and they would have had a field day slamming him down about that. And the second is he spends a lot of time giving philosophical expositions, diatribes, and you're not supposed to do that in a story. It's more like preaching. And often we find stories where a writer has a particular political or a philosophical or a religious viewpoint, and they spend a long time trying to convince us. We're like, I don't want that. What I want is the story. So I think probably that's the second reason why they would give him a hard time. But yeah, cosmic self. There's this time issue, the nature of time. Next thing is the illusion of self. And this is like very Hindu actually, and Buddhist, which is derived from Hinduism, philosophy, that there is no self. That the idea that you're a separate person is an illusion. I don't go with that, but but they're very keen on, the Buddhists particularly are very good at explaining it, so it almost seems like it is true. But I'll give you my defense of that. Their argument is when you look for what the core of oneself, you never find anything. You never find anything. There is nothing that you can say, oh, that's me. Never. And that's true. But when they say it's an illusion, therefore an illusion is something, isn't it? So even if our self is an illusion, it's still something. That's so. It's Easter now, and I think that's what Christianity does really well. Is that it says, it doesn't even say this is an illusion, but even if it were an illusion, it say, well, yeah, but we suffer. So Christianity speaks to the suffering in a different way than Buddhism does. Anyway, this is way off here, but there we are. I think it's interesting, and I think if Lovecraft can put his stuff forward, so can I. The other thing is dreams, and again, as already talked about, Lovecraft is seen against existentialism as a philosophical movement, but of course, from the 1890s, 1899, I think it was, the interpretation of dreams, Sigmund Freud was very much into dreams as having meaning. Now, Freud's dreams don't mean the same thing as Lovecraft's dreams, but they both give importance to messages from dreams, right? And then we move to Carl Jung, big follower of his, and who fell out with Freud. Now, Jung goes further than Freud, and he says, yes, dreams are a gateway to the collective unconscious, so all that is inside us, and we are the world, in a sense. We're made of the world, so there is an unconscious out there which presents itself to us in the language of dreams. It is, and so in this sense, he's in line with Lovecraft. I'm not sure he would have approved of Lovecraft really, but I don't know. I don't know if you ever read him, or if there's any comments from Jung about Lovecraft. But so Lovecraft himself is making the point that this is all unknowable. We just aren't the kind of things. We don't have the mental apparatus to understand what is going on. So we don't understand time. We don't understand dreams. We don't understand what we are. Lovecraft says that really well, I think, in his story. And Jung would say, yeah, there's some of it is unknowable, and it presents itself to us in symbolic form, and the closest we can get is to try and engage with those symbols it presents us. So I think that Lovecraft is doing this in this. It's probably why I like the story. So dreams as portals, yes. But of course, they didn't invent. I mean, the ancient Greeks had a thing called dream incubation. And they had certain places. Manteums, forget. Oh, Thana, something to do with that. And you would go and you would spend time there, and you would put yourself in the frame of mind to have a dream, a special dream, in which your dead relatives or the gods would give you messages. So it was a big deal for the Greeks. And then, of course, in the Bible, we also have, Joseph, there's Jacob's ladder, of course. God appears at the top of the ladder, and that, that's famous. And then we have Joseph's dream of going to Egypt, and he interprets the dreams of Pharaoh, doesn't he? And then we have Daniel, in the book of Daniel, where he is renowned for his ability to interpret dreams, including those of King Nebuchadnezzar. So these guys didn't invent dreams as messages and portals, but Lovecraft certainly presents that. So that's probably all I want to say. So I think what he's done in this story is he's introduced cosmic horror as a new genre, which mirrors existential dread that other very clever people in France and Denmark were talking about. And he echoes some ideas about that are current in religion, about and ideas of time, and some ideas which Jung would later talk about in perhaps in a more articulate way. And so those are real kudos for him. And he has this imagination and the illusion of self, which I think is worth talking about. Yeah, there we are. In some senses, he's I'm not sticking up for him, but his attitudes, his political attitudes and his racial attitudes were a product of his culture. That doesn't mean it's okay and you shouldn't challenge him. But what am I saying? I feel sorry for the guy, I guess. He was probably crippled by anxiety all his life. And he wrote some stories. And even though he wasn't successful in his life, his legacy is absolutely phenomenal. You think of all the writers we do, you think of M.R. James. Lovecraft's legacy arguably is greater than James. More people will tune into Lovecraft than M.R. James. And when you get into people like Edith Wharton and Henry James, you could argue that literarily, I made that word up, in terms of literature, they have a long shadow, they have influence. But in terms of pop culture, they're nowhere near as influential as Lovecraft. There we are. So great, just thoughts about him, really. I hope you enjoyed the story. And thank you again, Gavin Critchley, once again, my friend. I do appreciate your support.